The American presidents were people like you and me, at least that's how the founders intended it to be. Welcome to my new segment on the American presidents and their nicknames. We're going to begin with our very first president, or at least our first president under the Constitution, George Washington. Obviously, as the first president, George Washington set a lot of precedents. That is, he was the first at so many things, establishing tradition and patterns that would dominate the presidency for centuries to come. And for that exact reason, we're going to start with the positive nicknames, first being Father of his Country. Washington's role as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, as well as presiding over the Constitutional Convention and being the first elected president underneath the Constitution, he well deserved this title. During his time, he was also known as the American Cincinnatus. This references Roman history of a man also by the name of Cincinnatus who was a farmer and came out of retirement, took up the mantle of dictator to save the republic, and then voluntarily resigned and returned Rome to its republic status. Washington very famously resigned instead of running for a third term. This was unheard of, and there were no term limits for president at this point provisioned in the Constitution. This stunned European leaders who were used to military men turning into dictators and leading nations until their death. Washington was also referred to as His Excellency during his time. This was a common term for European nobility, but America didn't really stick. It was mostly used by revolutionary soldiers to refer to Washington in a positive light. The final positive nickname is Old Fox. He was referred to this mostly by the British because, just like foxes during fox hunts, George Washington was notoriously hard to pin down as an enemy combatant. George Washington and the armies he led eluded capture by superior British forces a number of times. And so as the Redcoats began to refer to him as the Old Fox in a derogatory way, just kind of like Yankee Doodle Dandy, Washington's own men took up the phrase in a more positive light, highlighting the scrappiness of the Continental Army and their leader. But just like you and I, Washington had his fair share of enemies and detractors both abroad and at home. So the most obvious negative nickname is going to be King George, or King Washington. As the leader of a new country, and a new country formed out of a former British colony, it was inevitable that George Washington would be compared to a George of the same name, the leader of England, King George III. But this went beyond the two being the heads of their respective militaries during the Revolutionary War. They were compared to each other throughout George Washington's first and second term as president. The political opponents of George Washington, particularly in his second term, began to grumble and gripe about his pomp and circumstance and his centralized power. You see, George Washington liked to host these things called levees. These were formal receptions where he carried himself with aristocratic ceremony. And this kind of regal bearing couldn't be explained away by the fact that he was an immigrant, because he wasn't. George Washington was a third-generation American. It was his great-great-grandfather who had initially moved to the state of Virginia. Continued support of centralized financial visions put forth by Alexander Hamilton.
My name is Alexander Hamilton.
And his rather heavy-handed response to the Whiskey Rebellion kind of painted him out to be somewhat of a monarch. And because of this, many of his political opponents feared that he would turn into a dictator. Now, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, but calling George Washington King George must have seemed appropriate at the time. An even darker negative nickname for George Washington is Conocutorius, and I might have mispronounced that incorrectly because it is a Native American nickname given to him by the Seneca. This name is commonly translated as Town Destroyer and was first given to his great-grandfather, John Washington. You see, in the 1670s, when the British were really starting to ramp up their colonization efforts in what would become Virginia, John Washington participated in several violent struggles where many Native American villages were entirely massacred. This nickname was used for John Washington by the Susquehannock people, but why did it stick to his grandson? Well, in the pre-revolution era, during the conflict known as the French and Indian War, which really was just the American theater of the 7 Years' War, Washington participated in several attacks against Native American people. George Washington's clashes with Native peoples continued well into the American Revolution, particularly with the Sullivan Expedition of 1795. The name was likely revived and reapplied to George Washington when he ordered this expedition, a scorched earth campaign against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that had mostly allied themselves with the British during that war. We have evidence that not only did George Washington know about the use of this nickname, he encouraged it. There's a signed letter from George Washington to the leaders of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy where he lists himself under the name Chronocatorius. To the native leaders, this negative nickname symbolized destruction, cultural annihilation, and Washington's true ruthlessness. This nickname wasn't just another battlefield epithet, it was a symbol of moral condemnation by the native peoples. You see, this is why it's important to remember the duality of man and recognize the fact that our founders were people. Good and bad both within them. The last nickname returns to a little bit of levity. A more obscure nickname used in his early career was the Stepchild of Fortune. Washington's early military career was disastrous, particularly the event in which his unit was massacred and started the French and Indian War and caused the 7-Year War to spill over to an entirely new continent. Not only that, but during the early Revolutionary War, the Continental Army suffered loss after loss after loss, and it looked like the British were going to win until a series of key turnaround battles where Washington really showed his success. So, perhaps he was a true stepchild of fortune. Today, we're going to be talking about number 2, John Adams.
John Adams?
Just like we did with good old George Washington, we're going to be talking today about John Adams' positive nicknames, something that he may have been referred to in correspondence by friends or admirers. And we're going to start off strong with many calling John Adams the Atlas of Independence. What a nickname. It's widely known that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but what's sometimes lesser well known is John Adams almost forcing him to do it. Adams was a fiery orator who persuaded many moderates to support his cause, basically bullying Congress into supporting the Declaration of Independence.
Good God, consider yourselves fortunate that you have John Adams to abuse, for no sane man would tolerate it.
His colleagues were known to say that Adams supported the document like Atlas supported the heavens. Moving right along to nickname number 2, he was also referred to as the Duke of Braintree. Now known as Quincy, Massachusetts, Braintree, Massachusetts was Adams' hometown, and this nickname started off as a little dig at how proud Adams was of his New England lineage. But this nickname also reflected respect, seeing Adams as a Yankee lawyer and even a bit aristocratic despite his anti-royal principles. And finally, number 3, he was hailed as the Man of Revolution. This nickname was primarily used by the press and admirers because even after the American Revolution, John Adams still served as an ambassador of these newborn United States, an ambassador to France, and his efforts with diplomacy when it came to the Treaty of Paris in 1783 kind of built this revolutionary halo about him. While Washington was well known as the father of our country, it was really Adams who kind of was the architect and gave independence some teeth. Though he was respected, Adams was famously, or rather infamously, not a charming man, and such a passionate orator had many enemies. One of the earliest satirical jabs against our second president came from his political opponents in the 1790s. If you lived during the era of his presidency and you wanted to insult John Adams, you would call him his rotundity. This was definitely in part because of John Adams' short and stocky stature and, well, being rather on the heftier side for his time, but also his political inclinations.
Sit down, John, you fat mother!
You see, during the early days of the executive branch, as titles were being figured out and certain aspects of the presidency were being written down, John Adams proposed that there should be a greater title for the head exec of the United States other than President of the United States. John Adams and those allied with him proposed the idea of the true name of the executive being His Majesty, the President of the United States. This, in combination with his desire to have the president referred to as His Highness, gave his political opponents, the Jeffersonians and Republicans at that time, ammunition to paint him as kind of out of touch with traditional American values. So as president, John kind of brought this on himself by giving his political opponents ammunition not only in his weight category, but his pompous puffery. This kind of folds on into number 2, where he was called the monarchist. As the new nation was coming together and became more politically recognizable to the governmental structure that we know today, John Adams rather rigorously defended British constitutionalism. Jeffersonian Republicans and revolutionaries of all shapes and sizes saw Adams' defense of the British form of government when the British had just been defeated in the Revolutionary War as a massive betrayal. Adams' critics twisted his desire to have an upper house in the legislature that would supposedly counter mobocracy or mob rule into the idea that Adams secretly wanted an American president. And this issue would dog him throughout his tenure.
They want to make that man the king of America.
And finally, for all his political strategy and his contributions to winning the Revolutionary War on the diplomacy side, Adams would still be mocked as the blunderer. When it came to his diplomatic efforts after the Revolutionary War, Adams was unfortunately ham-fisted. With the XYZ affair and the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, Adams made a great number of enemies, both foreign and domestic. In fact, he just barely avoided a war with France, a nation that had helped us win the Revolutionary War not a decade before. Even in his own correspondence, Adams admitted that he himself didn't believe he was a smooth political operator. His bluntness often made unnecessary enemies. So there you have it. Adams' penchant to become prickly, pompous, and paranoid during his presidency gave his political enemies some serious ammunition to come up with some banger nicknames for him. And today, we're going to move on to number 3, Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to talk about his positive nicknames. First to be found in speeches and textbooks and all sorts of writings from the 1800s, where you would have seen Thomas Jefferson called the Apostle of Democracy. This is primarily because Jefferson's political creed centered around popular or populist government, as well as agrarian republicanism and states' rights. Jefferson cast himself as this kind of common man, a white yeoman farmer, in kind of contrast to elites and centralizers like Alexander Hamilton and the aforementioned John Adams. Even today, Jefferson's name is invoked when people are talking about freedom and self-governance, which is kind of ironic considering as he preached democracy, he also owned slaves.
Tell the little hypocrite.
Something that his critics hammered on throughout his career. Moving on to after his retirement, Jefferson was referred to as the Sage of Monticello. This is because after his term as president, he withdrew to his estate in Virginia, also known as Monticello. This name of sage kind of accurately portrays Jefferson as this philosopher-statesman as he retired to Monticello, his home becoming this Enlightenment ideal. His home in Monticello became a kind of intellectual shrine with books, peculiar inventions, and all sorts of things scattered round. As such, this nickname emphasizes Jefferson's role as the American philosopher king, albeit without a crown. And of course, no list of positive nicknames about our third president would be complete without the nickname Author of the Declaration. Jefferson himself insisted that this epitaph be inscribed on his gravestone. You see, even in his time, Jefferson's way with words was legendary. He was only 33 years old when he wrote the Declaration of Independence.
You write 10 times better than any man in Congress.
This feat, let alone all his other political writings, immortalized the man as the voice of freedom and natural liberty for centuries to come. This nickname, arguably more than the others, is the one that is the most enduring. This is because it ties Thomas Jefferson to America's founding creed of freedom and independence. Alas, Jefferson didn't always live up to this founding creed, and he had plenty of negative nicknames that stuck with him both during and after his tenure as president. So today, we're going to cover 3 of Thomas Jefferson's most popular negative nicknames. And we're going to jump in here real quick with a first biting insult. A negative nickname for Thomas Jefferson would have been Long Tom. This was a jab at Jefferson's tall and lanky stature. He stood nearly 6'2", which was gigantic for his era. And he didn't help himself very much. From what we know of historical accounts, he carried himself with this awkward, shambling gait that his political opponents seized on. And as I highlighted in a previous episode, he kind of made this kind of physical teasing fair game. He and his anti-federalist friends were quick on the draw to make fun of their opponent's physical stature, especially John Adams.
Sit down, John, you fat mother...
But this nickname wasn't just about his physical stature. Those who didn't like him considered him slippery, aloof, and cold in conversations, rarely showing his true thoughts and intentions. So Jefferson's opponents of all shapes and sizes used the nickname Long Tom to make fun of both his body and his persona. Yeah, the next nickname I'm not going to say out loud, for good reasons, because this is it. This was a controversial nickname even in its time. It was thrown at Jefferson because of his support of the 3/5 Compromise. The 3/5 Compromise is an ugly deal that was made in 1787 to ostensibly prevent a civil war, which would end up happening a century later anyways for this very reason. States in the South during this time raised the issue that they believed they had inadequate political representation in Congress and the presidency, and a deal was reached to count 3/5 of a slave state's population of enslaved people when it came to population calculations for political representation. I could definitely get more into the weeds on this.
Get on with it!
But suffice it to say, Jefferson's association with it and support of it, and the fact that it pretty much guaranteed his election to the presidency, was illegitimate because it was propped up by a system that he supposedly claimed to hate when he wrote the phrase, "All men are created equal."
Do you or do you not hold that the precept that all men are created equal is meant literally?
And finally, we have the nickname Mad Tom. It's a well-known historical fact that Jefferson was an avid Francophile. He loved France and its culture, and he spent a great deal of time there after the American Revolution. But that adoration continued even as the French Revolution spiraled into what we now know as the Reign of Terror. Jefferson famously wrote that he would rather see the earth drenched in blood than liberty die. He wrote that, quote, "The tree of liberty must from time to time be refreshed by the blood of patriots and tyrants." His political enemies and those across the nation used this to paint him as a dangerous, radical man who wanted to bring the guillotines to America. Now, this nickname faded after he governed as president and proved to be very, very moderate, very middle of the road, but it was a very potent smear in its time. So you see, those who wanted to defame Thomas Jefferson had quite the repertoire of insults at their disposal, and in fact there were several, including atheist and the philosopher, several others that I didn't cover in this video. If you want a longer video, let me know in the comments. I'm Teddy Ebby, and this has been the 3 most popular negative nicknames of our 3rd U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson. Join me next time when we talk about our 4th U.S. President, James Madison, and his 3 most popular positive nicknames. We're going to start out with an easy one, Father of the Constitution. This one is kind of a no-brainer. After the Articles of Confederation, the first documents to govern the United States, after they failed, James Madison was a key member of the Constitutional Convention, deciding on the specifics of the Constitution which would eventually come to shape our nation. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Madison came to Philadelphia, to the Constitutional Convention, with plans in mind. He was a strong proponent of the Virginia Plan, something that would eventually push the Constitution through deadlock. He and his political allies built a blueprint that would create a federal government that was strong and centralized, but not overly so. On his own, he is a huge person that we have to thank for the checks and balances that keep the modern United States government in check. Not only that, but during the Constitutional Convention, he took exhaustive notes, writing about what was being said in the room where it happened. So all in all, he had a huge hand in the writing of the Constitution and even later wrote the Federalist Papers in order to help to defend the document against political disagreements. The second nickname is even more interesting. He was also known to his friends as Little Jemmy. Now, you would think that this was built out of a negative nickname, and that is somewhat true. Madison's enemies would also seize upon this nickname, but a majority of it was used positively. This is because James Madison was small. He was lightly built and only 5'4", but compared to both the political and statuesque giants of the day, like Washington and Jefferson, both standing over 6 feet tall, and John Adams being such a firebrand that it made up for any shortness on his part, friends and allies used this nickname affectionately to emphasize his quiet brilliance. You see, Madison might have been bookish and soft-spoken, but he wielded enormous political clout behind the scenes. It was his friends, allies, and later historians who would recognize this and use that nickname of Little Jemmy. And last but not least, he's also known as the father of political parties. It's a commonly touted fact that in his farewell address, George Washington advised against the creation of political parties. There's a little bit more nuance to this, but James Madison was integral in the creation of the first political parties in the United States. So initially, with the Articles of Confederation in tatters, and the United States of America born from 13 colonies, now on the brink of another revolution, Madison worked with Federalists like Hamilton and Adams to push the Constitution through. But the Constitution wasn't enough for Hamilton and his Federalist allies.
Has never been satisfied.
And Madison began to push back against initiatives like the formation of the National Bank. And that led him to ally himself with Thomas Jefferson and form a coalition to fight against a coalition that would eventually become political parties. These were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. These arguments of a government that is big or small, centralized or localized, rural and agrarian or urban and city-like, have pervaded U.S. politics ever since, for over 200 years.
Are you a Democrat or Republican up there?
So you can see that James Madison thoroughly deserves the title of the father of political parties. Now this definitely feels a little blasphemous. The Constitution, one of James Madison's crowning achievements, was signed today, September 17th, 1787, 238 years ago. But alas, the man had his enemies, so we must talk about his negative nicknames. And we're going to start off with a reference from his positive nicknames, because this nickname was also twisted on its head and used as an insult. He was known to many as Little Jemmy. Yes, Madison was only 5'4" and about 120 pounds, but that was kind of overshadowed by the fact that he was sickly, constantly sick. Not only that, but his calm, quiet demeanor was just overshadowed by the military heroes and fiery orators that had preceded him. So critics would often say that Little Jemmy looks a little bit more like a school teacher and less like a leader. Moving right on to number 2, they also called James Madison the Puppet. The origin of the belief that James Madison was a puppet president came from the president elected directly before him, Thomas Jefferson. Both Jefferson and Madison were staunch anti-federalists, believers in smaller government, Democratic Republicans.
Democratic Republicans!
And the Federalists, their direct enemies, were still stinging from their defeat to Jefferson in the third presidential terms. Jefferson and Madison's proximity and the comparisons that they naturally drew dogged Madison throughout his whole presidency. Madison was seen as this kind of sidekick to Jefferson, not blazing his own trail, but following up on his mentor's footsteps. So you can see why his detractors said that he lacked courage and originality and accused him of riding into the presidency on Jefferson's coattails. And the last negative nickname that we're going to throw at this founding father is a little bit less well known. He was also insulted as Jemmy the Junto. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, a junto was a slang term for a political or military cabal, a shadowy organization interested in taking control of the government.
You don't think that the lizard people are behind the shadow government?
Madison's alliance with Jefferson to form the Democratic Republican Party, as well as dragging the fledgling United States into the War of 1812, gave enemies ammunition to accuse Madison reputation of being a backroom partisan dealmaker. All of these nicknames were meant to sully his reputation as this practical philosopher and instead paint him as this short, sickly, conniving manipulator. So there you have it. The negative nicknames for the 4th U.S. President, James Madison. I promise, he wasn't all bad. Please go back and watch the video about his positive nicknames because that man did a lot for the United States.
Look back at the Bill of Rights, which I wrote.
I'm Teddy Ebby. Join me next time when we talk about our 5th U.S. President, James Monroe, and his positive nicknames. We're going to start off things simple with his first positive nickname being the last founding father. James Monroe was born in 1758, just before the heap of revolutionary fervor and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. By the time he ascended to the presidency, most of the other founding fathers had left James Monroe either by passing away or moving on to other projects. Not only that, but he was the last U.S. president to serve in the Revolutionary War, where he attained the rank of major.
Well, I know that, Major, sir.
So after him, both militarily and politically, the founding fathers are gone from the line of the presidency.
They're gone?
In history, he's seen as this kind of bridge character in between the founding fathers and the presidents that would follow, so he really is kind of the last founding father. Moving right on to number 2, he was also known as the Era of Good Feelings president. His election in 1817 followed the end of the War of 1812 and a period of political instability in the United States, not to mention the partisan rhetoric between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or the Democratic Republicans, seemed to calm down in this period, and the nation had begun to unite. The fledgling country's economy was booming. People were optimistic.
What an economic boom, Kaminsky.
Not only that, but Monroe was a whiz kid when it came to foreign policy, acquiring Florida from the Spanish Empire. While the question of slavery still did persist throughout his presidency, it was kind of overshadowed by this general feeling of goodness, an era of good feelings. If you were white, male, and a landowner. This all culminates in nickname number 3, the Monroe Doctrine Man. The Monroe Doctrine enshrined James's place in the league of presidents with foreign policy excellence. The United States had come out of the War of 1812 battered and bruised, and across the ocean, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Jefferson looked at Europe licking their chops, ready to take a bite.
That poor man, they're going to eat him alive.
Through a series of foreign policy declarations, James Monroe and his allies made it clear to the leading powers in Europe that in exchange for not meddling in European affairs, the United States expected that European powers would cease their attempts to further colonize the New World. In a sense, right or wrong, James Monroe took a stand and basically said, this Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, an American sphere of influence. And in a few short steps, James Monroe pushed the fledgling United States onto the world stage. And the European powers? They listened. To an extent. This would serve as the pitch of U.S. interventionism in the entire rest of the world.
He said this brutish and hypocritical American intervention will not go unanswered.
So this singular nickname, born from this singular action, would set up presidents down the line from Monroe up with their own positive and negative nicknames, sometimes informed by their own attempts at U.S. interventionism. Jumping right into a geographical negative nickname, he is often referred as the last of the Virginians. This is because Monroe was seen as the tail end of the so-called Virginian dynasty. Excluding John Adams, it went Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and now Monroe, another wealthy elite Virginia planter.
This business needs a Virginian.
Americans from the North and the newly minted West complained about the Virginian stranglehold on the presidency, and this nickname was often spoken as, thank God, the last of the Virginians. While we are moving on from regional digs, the next negative nickname also harkens to Monroe's past. He was often ridiculed as being Jefferson's errand boy. You see, Monroe suffered similarly to Madison, his predecessor, in that they were both dominated by Thomas Jefferson's influence. Kinda difficult to play second fiddle to the man who wrote the very Declaration of Independence.
I always got a great kick out of that part of the Declaration of Independence.
But this hit Monroe particularly hard because he was one of the younger founding fathers. Federalists sneered at Monroe, saying he was dispatched hither and thither on Jefferson's will, having to do very little of his own independent thinking. Thank goodness for the Monroe Doctrine, otherwise he may have been relegated to this nickname for eternity in history. And finally, a nickname that was kind of a dud, He was also called the mediocre man. Monroe had the benefit of an extremely stable presidency with economic booms, Europe too busy with their infighting, as well as the question of the legality of slavery being kicked down the road by Jefferson's 3/5 compromise. As such, with a profound lack of crises, James Monroe was accused of just being mediocre. And perhaps he was, but he was the best man for the job at the time. But that's enough about Monroe. And you may be asking yourselves, but didn't we already talk about John Adams? Yeah, we talked about John Adams Sr. We're talking about his son, John Quincy Adams, or John Adams Jr.
No, silly, it's his son.
So here we are encountering our first father-son duo of the presidency, not to be repeated until George Herbert Walker Bush and George Bush Jr. So without further ado, John Quincy Adams' most used positive nickname was Old Man Eloquent. Ironically, this nickname actually comes for his career that took place after his term in the presidency. After his term in the White House, John Quincy Adams didn't retire and go home. He returned to the People's House, the House of Representatives. Just like his father, John Quincy Adams was known for his fiery speeches and his passionate oration. He was also well known for being a huge abolitionist, a proponent against the expansion of slavery. His speeches on the floor of the House of Representatives were some of the most well-written ever to be spoken in that hallowed hall.
People don't talk that way anymore.
But what he spoke about was what really earned him positive nickname number 2, the Hellhound of Abolition. Perhaps even more than his father, John Quincy Adams was vehemently anti-slavery.
Today's subject, slavery.
And he held the nation's highest office in a time when Southern plantation owners held an enormous amount of political clout. He inspired his abolitionist allies when he fought against a parliamentary procedure known as the gag rule, which prevented members of Congress from even talking about petitions that would impact slavery. Both during his presidency and after, he stood as a symbol of moral courage against overwhelming opposition. And this nickname framed him as this relentless, almost dogged defender of liberty. And this fits in nicely with his third and final popular positive nickname, the Man of Purity. You see, Quincy Adams was known for his integrity. Even his most fierce political enemies wouldn't have a leg to stand on if they had accused him of any sort of impropriety. His frugal, often austere lifestyle and refusal to bend to the will of any of the political machines or parties that were abound during his time earned him this respectable title.
It was just too much of a goody two-shoes for him.
So it's easy to see that John Quincy Adams was a rare man in DC politics even then. He was a principled man who wouldn't compromise his beliefs. But rarely do one's enemies only result to slinging truths at you when coming up with insults. And the same is true for the enemies of John Quincy Adams. So today we're going to go over the 3 most popular negative nicknames for John Quincy Adams. And we're going to start off with a real zinger. His enemies often called him the Pimp of the Presidency.
Pimp?
This is because in the election of 1824, no candidate won a clear majority in the Electoral College. So, the question of who would be president went to the House of Representatives. The then Speaker of the House, a man by the name of Henry Clay, threw his support behind Adams, which would get him the presidency. Later, when John Quincy Adams appointed Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, Adams's enemies cried foul and said that there must have been a deal behind closed doors where Adams ostensibly bought the presidency by promising to give Henry Clay a cabinet position.
Well, this comes with a quid pro quo, fair exchange.
Even though there was never any evidence of any backroom dealing, Adams's enemies like to say that he pimped out the presidency and used this negative nickname against him. And that'll bring us right into negative nickname number 2. He was also known as the Obstructionist. John Quincy Adams was through and through a Federalist, and he had grand ideas about national improvements, national infrastructure projects, and even a national university.
Big government taxes are back, boys.
Congress was packed full of politicians loyal to Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian Democrats, who opposed these measures because they saw them as overreaches of federal power. They opposed Quincy Adams at every opportunity, and John didn't help himself when he refused to cooperate with them.
I will not cooperate.
So he was seen as this stubborn old man with ideas far beyond the country's political mood at the time. His refusals to even compromise lent him that negative nickname. And finally, he was also mocked as the snob of Massachusetts. Just like his father, John Quincy Adams had an attitude problem. He was seen as cold and aloof with this kind of feeling of self-superiority where he looked down on most Americans. And this is on top of a long political career abroad in Europe. He served as the ambassador to Prussia, Russia, and many other European powers. His enemies and Jacksonian Democrats embraced a kind of populism that he abhorred. They distrusted the political elite, and he was emblematic of them. Though he would leave the White House as a lame duck president, he would continue to fight the good fight in the House of Representatives. And his enemy, Andrew Jackson, learned to play politics and won the presidency the next time, making him the 7th United States president. And while we're going to be talking about his positive nicknames, it's somewhat difficult to narrow down the list because Andrew Jackson is one of the most nicknamed presidents in U.S. history.
They all have their little nicknames, but I prefer to use the names their parents gave them.
This is because in both the eyes of his friends and his enemies, he loomed larger than life. His first most popular positive nickname is one he is incredibly well known for, Old Hickory.
So I took out Old Hickory here, and I gave him a two-handed shot.
You see, this is because hickory wood is known to be incredibly tough, and Andrew Jackson had a reputation for being just as tough, if not tougher. He was first and foremost a military man, admired by his soldiers because of the fact that he went through their hardships with them, marching alongside of them instead of riding a horse, eating what they ate, refusing all luxuries. He really was a man who inspired his soldiers. Later on, this would also become his political brand. His supporters used the nickname to emphasize his resilience and manliness.
Stanley is such a manly man.
It stuck so well that in the writings of modern-day historians, they describe him by this nickname even as he enters into the White House. And it's that tough-as-nails reputation that pushes us right into nickname number 2, the Hero of New Orleans. The pinnacle of Jackson's military career was during the War of 1812, when the fledgling United States was fighting the British once more. While a majority of the United States' army was engaged with the British up north fighting in Canada, Jackson was in command of troops down south. While the war was winding down diplomatically, there were still battles and engagements along the frontier. None were more iconic than when Andrew Jackson himself led a ragtag militia composed of frontiersmen, free blacks, and native allies against a veteran British army and proceeded to rout them out of the city. This high-profile victory vaulted Jackson to instant national fame, and though it wouldn't win him the immediate presidency, it definitely set him up for his eventual win as the 7th U.S. president. Thus, he would be forever known as a war hero president. Though he was a warrior, he definitely earned nickname number 3 as the People's President. Jackson was ostensibly the first truly American president. You see, this is because he broke the streak of elitists in the White House. He wasn't a rich Virginia planter like Washington, Jefferson, or Madison, and he also wasn't a New England aristocrat like John Adams or his son John Quincy. Andrew Jackson wasn't born into wealth at all. He had a frontier upbringing. His supporters liked to hail him as a self-made man, somebody who they could relate to, a real man of the people. His charismatic force was so powerful that it inspired an entire movement of Jacksonian Democrats.
You are a Democrat.
The idea of the president being someone who embodies the will of the common man is indebted to Andrew Jackson. No wonder the man is on the $20 bill. But he was just a man, fallible like us all, and he had plenty of negative nicknames. I won't keep it a secret. Andrew Jackson is not one of my favorite presidents.
Frankly, I don't like the guy, but I never saw a hooligan I did like.
So it was difficult finding positive nicknames for the man that I thought applied and were historically truthful. Today we really get to rip into him because we're going to be doing his negative nicknames and more than the original 3 I had planned. Andrew Jackson was a president with promise. As one of the first presidents not to come from the elite classes, there were many hopes about who he would be, and in many ways, he fell terribly short.
What a disappointment you turned out to be.
This can be perfectly seen in the first nickname that we're talking about today because his political opponents called him King Andrew I. He was most likely called this because Jackson used the presidential powers much like the military man he was. Many of his enemies and even some of his allies worried that he was stepping beyond his constitutional limits. He vetoed more bills sent to his desk by Congress than the other 6 U.S. presidents before him combined.
No use vetoing that program, Johnson.
Not only that, but he even defied the Supreme Court when he refused to enforce their decision in Worcester v. Georgia.
You can't tell me what to do because you're not my mom.
This all landed him with that famous, or rather infamous, negative nickname, and a timeless political cartoon to boot. All in all, the worry that Jackson took a step towards making the presidency a cult of personality weren't entirely unfounded. And this moves us into a darker negative nickname. In nickname number 2, he was called Sharp Knife by many Native American tribes. It is an unfortunately well-known fact that Andrew Jackson held no love for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. From his military campaigns against the Creek Indigenous Nation to his support and enforcement of the Indian Removal Act, which resulted in the Trail of Tears, a borderline genocidal event that is and will forever be a stain on American history. Native peoples used the nickname Sharp Knife not to emphasize his bravery, but his brutality and betrayal, and his figurative cutting up of treaties that had guaranteed them land rights. Bringing things back up to a lighter note with negative nickname number 3, he was also mocked as the Jackass.
Well, if it's all the same to you, I'll just call you Jackass.
His political opponents used this nickname to stress Jackson's stubbornness and ignorance. But this kind of backfired because Jackson loved the idea of being associated with the donkey, enjoying the association with toughness and determination. So much so that the donkey became the figurative animal for the Jacksonian Democrats and even endures as the Democratic Party's emblem today. And finally, that bonus negative nickname that I promised you. He was also known as Old Hickory Headed. It was actually a riff off of one of the positive nicknames that I talked about where he was known as Old Hickory. While that positive nickname emphasized his toughness and durability, this one flipped the script. Jackson was stubborn to a fault, and that often got him in trouble. And this was clearest when he found himself on the wrong side of a policy debate. Jackson was not a well-educated man, and oftentimes he was too stubborn and too stupid to recognize that he might be wrong.
Can't you get it through your thick skull I'm working for the government?
Though psychologists wouldn't study the idea of stupid people being more likely to think they're smart until centuries later, his enemies would have you believe that Jackson was a walking, talking Dunning-Kruger effect. This time, we'll be talking about President number 8, his successor, Martin Van Buren, and his 3 most popular positive nicknames. Now, interestingly enough, Martin Van Buren is one of those presidents whose reputation has gone from good to bad to good to bad throughout history.
Look, there's good and bad to everybody, right?
Most of his positive nicknames come from the fact that he was a smooth political operator, and that's the case with nickname number 1. People called Martin Van Buren the Little Magician. While yes, this nickname does reference the fact that Martin Van Buren was one of the shorter presidents at 5'6".
I never met a short man that stayed nice all the way through.
More focuses on the fact that he had an uncanny ability to manage people and organize alliances. The nickname really accentuates his ability to calm the political chaos of his era and pull victories seemingly out of thin air. This nickname had him hailed as a brilliant, almost magical political strategist. He was the perfect hand-picked successor to Andrew Jackson, turning Jackson's momentary populist movement into something more durable, long-lasting, and nationwide. This will round us right around to nickname number 2, Old Kinderhook. While this nickname is based on his birthplace, there is a little bit more to it than that. Kinderhook is a town in upstate New York, not too far from the state's capital region.
It's a business, Kinderhook.
New York.
Van Buren was massively popular in his home state, particularly rural regions, where they referred to him as Old Kinderhook. And it's even believed, though hotly debated, that the nickname Old Kinderhook was shortened to OK. There is evidence, although it is slightly shaky, that the modern term OK originates from a slogan in his 1840 re-election campaign, which was "Vote for OK." That nickname might have resonated with salt-of-the-earth upstate New Yorkers so much so that it's made its own mark in history. Which brings us into the third and final positive nickname for Martin Van Buren. He's known as the Builder. After the near collapse of the Anti-Federalist Party morphing into the Democratic-Republican Party, Van Buren was instrumental in pulling back together the shattered coalition that these two parties left. He recognized and believed that political parties aren't necessarily dangerous factions to be avoided, but instead are essential structures for representing the will of the people in a democratic society.
Oh no, I'm not brave enough for politics.
You see, even though the Democratic Party would go through many changes over the next 2 centuries, the nickname emphasizes Van Buren's contributions to modern politics as we know it. You can see that for such a small and mild-mannered man, Martin Van Buren was quite the mover and shaker. But some people don't like it when you move and shake things too much. Those people might make up negative nicknames for you. For somewhat of an obscure president, he had some really intense insults attributed to him. His aforementioned political brilliance made him an invaluable ally to some and a bitter enemy to others. But we're going to start with a nickname that pushes politics to the side and instead focuses on economics. Martin Van Buren was also insulted frequently in the press as Martin Van Ruin. This nickname comes from the fact that Martin Van Buren inherited a really shaky economy after his predecessor Andrew Jackson left the White House. After Jackson shut down the second attempt at a national bank.
I'm no First National Bank.
The public blamed Van Buren when the economy tanked in the Panic of 1837. Unemployment skyrocketed, businesses failed, and banks closed their doors. And the press, notorious for inflaming public tensions, latched onto this nickname and printed it in newspapers everywhere.
This is why I hate reporters.
The nickname Martin Van Ruin was everywhere. Political slogans, cartoons, and even songs featured the negative nickname, trashing the president. It was such a pervasive negative nickname that Van Buren's opponent in the 1840 election, William Henry Harrison, barely had to do any sort of negative campaigning. This nickname did it all for him. And that will swing us back into politics with negative nickname number 2. Martin Van Buren was hailed as the American Machiavelli.
They're gonna think it's some kind of Machiavellian Jedi power play.
For those unaware, Niccolo Machiavelli was an Italian philosopher during the Renaissance. He was famous, or rather infamous, for his political writings in his book, The Prince. In his book, Machiavelli advises the politicians of the day to, yes, be pragmatic, but also to be ruthless and to be feared rather than loved. Dragging it back to Martin Van Buren, American president several centuries later, he's seen in a Machiavellian light. Yes, he was a political whiz kid, forming coalitions here and there and everywhere, getting people on both the left and the right to agree to things they rather wouldn't. That often required a certain degree of political manipulation and Machiavellian tactics. To get what he wanted, Martin Van Buren would often step on the toes of friends and allies, and to him, I suppose, the ends justified the means.
You betrayed your nation, Bob.
And finally, we'll round out with negative nickname number 3. He's also known as the Dandy President. In the 19th century, dandy referred to a man who was overly obsessed with his appearance. A modern term for comparison would be calling someone metrosexual.
Must have been that metrosexual scruffle you got there.
While he did seize on the populism that Jackson had left him, he wasn't a military man by any means. Martin Van Buren certainly was a different man than his predecessor, and critics accused him of being obsessed with fashion, etiquette, and even perfume. Opponents from within his own party circulated cartoons of Van Buren primping and preening himself in front of a mirror as the nation's economy went up in flames. This negative nickname undercut any man of the people vibes that were given to him by his positive nicknames like Old Kinderhook. Not only that, but it served to make his opponent in the next presidential race look rugged in comparison. But today, we're going to cover the positive nicknames of the man with the shortest presidential term in U.S. history, President number 9, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison is the shortest serving president because of a fateful mistake he made regarding his presidential address. After a grueling election campaign that must have left him exhausted, Harrison made the ill-informed decision not to wear a hat or coat or any warm clothing at all as he gave a 2-hour inaugural address in the freezing rain in early March. Just weeks later, he would be the first man to die while President of the United States.
So we can all learn from William Henry Harrison to wear our coats and wash our hands so we have better immune systems.
But despite his rather short term in office, he accrued quite a few positive nicknames. So we'll start with his most famous rallying cry, Old Tippecanoe. After a break from having military men in the White House with the election of Martin Van Buren, the electorate turned its attention back to the Army with William Henry Harrison, who was a major general or a 2-star general during the War of 1812. But this nickname would actually come from his skirmishes with Native Americans. He fought a confederation of Native American tribes when he was governor of the territory of Indiana. He got this nickname from the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he fought against a Shawnee prophet by the name of Tenskwatawa, who was the lesser-known brother of then Shawnee chief Tecumseh. Regardless of the ethics of it, the battles were fierce and won William Henry Harrison a great deal of military honor.
You should be ashamed of your military honor!
He heavily leaned on this military honor to catapult himself into the White House, using this nickname in the slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too, bringing in his then Vice President John Tyler. But this positive nickname is much more akin to self-aggrandizement, as he was really just a Virginian aristocrat turned Western politician and military hero, which kind of folds us into nickname number 2, where he was called the Log Cabin Candidate. Harrison did indeed move from Virginia and the lands of the 13 colonies, much more well settled, out west to these new territories that were wild and undiscovered. Harrison's supporters used this positive nickname to reframe him as this kind of cider-drinking, log cabin dwelling frontiersman. And I'll digress. It did take some guts to move from the well-established eastern coast out into the Midwest, even if you were a wealthy aristocrat with means.
Yeah, you look like, just like a rich cowboy who came riding in off the farm.
And this not quite true positive nickname is a great example of early instances of mass political branding, which will round us out into nickname number 3. Just like his predecessor 2 presidents before him, Andrew Jackson, he was referred to as the People's President. Harrison's presidential campaign is known in political science history for its mass rallies, songs, banners, slogans, and even infiltration into modern-day language. Harrison just had this populist energy about him.
I'm a plain man of the people.
An energy that would unfortunately fade after one of these famous speeches in the rain caused him to fall ill and die. And though they wouldn't have more than a few weeks to insult him in office, Harrison picked up his fair share of negative nicknames. And even though he only served 32 days in office, he also accrued his fair share of negative nicknames, things that people would have called him to make fun of him. So today, we're going to talk about those 3 most popular negative nicknames. Without further ado, we're going to call attention to perhaps my favorite negative nickname used for a president so far. William Henry Harrison was often mocked as Old Granny Harrison. Harrison had already reached the ripe old age of 68 when he ran for the presidency in 1840.
He's an old man now.
Nowadays, that might not seem that old, with sitting President Donald Trump being 79 years old, and his predecessor, former President Joe Biden, turning 82 at the time of this filming. But you gotta remember, this was nearly 200 years ago, and William Henry Harrison, at 68, was the oldest man who had ever run for the presidency, and that record wouldn't be broken again until Ronald Reagan.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Harrison's enemies, particularly Martin Van Buren supporters, used this negative nickname to portray him as too frail to handle the responsibilities of the presidency. But ironically, this negative nickname kind of backfired because it portrayed Harrison as this experienced elder statesman.
He's smooth, he's competent, he's experienced.
Harrison. So when mocking his age didn't work, his enemies pivoted and instead focused on his physical attributes, with this next negative nickname calling Harrison the Hoosier Giant. Even today, Hoosier is a slang term for somebody from the state of Indiana.
That's a Hoosier, Jeff!
After he moved from the politically crowded and complicated East out to the frontier of Indiana, Harrison became a giant of a force in frontier politics. Critics tried to use this frontiersman politician persona that Harrison had cultivated about himself to present the man as unsophisticated and unfit for office.
We might seem like small-town, unsophisticated people to you, but we've got our pride.
But again, being a man who moved from the East to settle the West, this negative nickname kind of fell flat. This wasn't so with the third and final negative nickname, where he was called the Puppet of the Whigs. Now, this isn't wigs as in the hair that you wear on your head. This is wigs as in the political party. Whig Party was a very short-lived political party that stood in opposition to the Democrats in the mid-1800s. They stood in strong opposition to the Jacksonian Democrats, who, while they preferred a smaller government, loved a domineering head of state in Andrew Jackson, a very powerful president. The Whigs, they preferred American power be centralized in the lawmakers in Congress instead.
On behalf of the great and incorruptible Whig Party, God bless it.
So they made sure that the candidate they put their support behind, William Henry Harrison, was loyal to them. Harrison's critics said that he was far too beholden to the party and that he would just go along with whatever the leaders in Congress said. But unfortunately, he wouldn't live long enough for us to know whether he had the courage to chart his own course. Previously stated, he would die only 32 days into office, and he would be succeeded by the president we're going to be talking about next time, John Tyler, his vice president and the 10th president of the United States. John Tyler is more than just the first man to go from vice president to president after his predecessor's death. No, he had accomplishments of his own, and we're going to be talking about them with his three most popular positive nicknames, things people would have called him to encourage him.
I want to be the one to come up with the cool nickname.
His career in the White House was marked by independence, controversy, and severe stubbornness. In political circles, John Tyler was well known as the Resolute Virginian. Obviously, from the state of Virginia, an original of the 13 colonies, John Tyler continued in that grand political theory of Jeffersonian politics, following after the likes of Thomas Jefferson. John Tyler was dedicated to the ideals of individual liberty and limited government.
That's really key to me, having a kind of a God-friendly, God-conscious society with limited government that believes it is not God, but it is there to serve the people.
He had this quiet steadfastness about him, even in the midst of the most turbulent political storms. When other politicians would be screaming red in the face at each other from across the aisle, John Tyler would simply stand there, resolute as a Virginian should, and brook no argument. His word was law.
I am the law, okay?
His leadership and devotion would link his legacy with the likes of Washington, Madison, Monroe, and Jefferson. Truly, John Tyler earned his place in history in the League of Virginian Presidents.
Virginians!
And we can't move on without addressing the elephant in the room. John Tyler was the first man to succeed someone already seated in the presidential office. And thus, he was called the well-earned nickname, the father of presidential succession. As the first president to succeed a president, John Tyler set many precedents, or the first orders of doing things.
He's looking for some sort of legal precedent that I'm not sure exists.
But you see, at that point, the Constitution offered no explicit guidance on whether in the death of a president, the vice president became the president or acted as one. There were lawmakers in Congress who were calling for a new presidential election just 2 months after the last one had been sworn into office. But once again, John Tyler stood resolute and asserted his right to ascend to the presidency. And because of this, every transition from vice president to president has followed this Tyler precedent. Whether on purpose or not, John Tyler set set up a cornerstone of American continuity of government. And with that, he earned this nickname and some well-deserved respect. And finally, another bit of controversy in nickname number 3, where John Tyler was referred to as the annexation president. You see, just before he left office in 1845, John Tyler successfully negotiated the annexation of what would become the state of Texas. This was controversial because his own political party, the Whigs, were against any sort of manifest destiny or westward expansion. But John Tyler saw the political wisdom in bringing the Republic of Texas into the fold. He pushed hard for annexation, and despite the fact that it caused a rift between him and his party, he won this moniker of the annexation president, along with geopolitical clout and the geography that is Texas.
The sign said, "Don't mess with Texas."
But it wasn't only the fight with his own political party at the end of his presidency that drew the man enemies. His stubbornness built them all throughout his term as president. And enemies, particularly of that political era, would make up many negative nicknames to make fun of you. And with this unique way that he ascended to the presidency, he brought some of the most colorful and politically charged negative nicknames the office had ever seen. These negative nicknames reveal John Tyler for the polarizing historical character that he was, going from celebrated running mate to eventual political exile. And that is best showcased in today's first negative nickname, where he was called the President Without a Party. You see, John Tyler and his predecessor William Henry Harrison were put into the White House by the political party known as the Whigs. And the Whigs, at that point led by Henry Clay, had hoped that William Henry Harrison would be a rubber stamp kind of president for them, just saying yes, yes to whatever the Whigs in Congress put on his desk. But John Tyler, he was put on the ballot to kind of balance William Henry Harrison.
Mr. Briggs' only trouble is that he could never be a yes man.
And when he entered the White House, boy did he show that he was not like William Henry Harrison. He would break rank with his own political party so often that in 1841, he would get kicked from the party. This was in the midst of his presidency, and he remains the only president in U.S. history to be removed from his own political party while in office.
You are no longer welcome here.
Political newspapers of the day branded him a Judas, claiming that he had only run under the Whigs' banner to achieve power and then betrayed them for his own ambition. What's worse is the party opposite the Whigs, the Democrats at that time, wouldn't take him in either. They disagreed with him entirely. This left John Tyler powerless, friendless, and politically homeless for the rest of his career as president.
I know what it's like to feel abandoned.
Calling John Tyler the president without a party wasn't inaccurate at all, and it showed that a man who stood alone wasn't necessarily standing alone because it was principled, but instead because he was crippled. Politically, that is. But the reason why the Whigs kicked him out brings us into nickname number 2, where John Tyler was well known as the veto president. We previously talked about Andrew Jackson and how he used the veto power indiscriminately. John Tyler would come dangerously close to unseating Jackson's record, only vetoing 2 less bills than the man. And importantly, John Tyler lacked Jackson's public mandate and charisma.
I've been told I have no charisma.
Exactly.
So critics accused him of using the veto power for personal rather than philosophical reasons. This nickname really showcases the stubbornness that defined John Tyler's presidency. His critics made up these negative nicknames because they believed that his reliance on the veto power showed that he led by rejection and not by leadership. And finally, those same critics would literally belittle John Tyler by nicknaming him his Little Excellency. There were a lot of negative effects born from the fact that John Tyler had to time and time again defend what he believed was his right to ascend to the presidency. His constant assertions that he belonged in the White House were all too easy to misconstrue as him being vain and pompous. Couple that with the fact that John Tyler had that kind of aristocratic bearing that many Virginian gentlemen had at the time. And this was all distilled down by his detractors who believed that he was a self-important, self-aggrandizing small man playing at king.
I am the king!
Any man who must say, "I am the king," is no true king.
And truly, he was one of the most politically divisive men of his era, earning such nicknames as the Texas Traitor as well. But for now, I think that's where we'll leave it. I'm Teddy Ebby. These have been the 3 most popular negative nicknames of John Tyler, President number 10. Next time, we're going to be moving on to President number 11, James K. Polk, and his 3 most popular positive nicknames. Polk was one of those presidents who entered the office with a bullet point plan, accomplished everything, and retired after one term in office like, all right, I'm done.
You see, I get things done.
Therefore, his positive nicknames reflect that kind of ambition, discipline, and Jacksonian inheritance that defined his term in office. And speaking of Jackson, he is directly responsible for JamesKPolk's first most popular positive nickname, calling him Young Hickory. During his term, several presidents prior, Andrew Jackson was referred to as Old Hickory. This was to highlight his stubbornness, strength, and determination in office. And Polk earned the nickname Young Hickory as a sort of tribute to his ideological mentor. Polk was a protege of the 7th U.S. president, a Jacksonian Padawan of sorts.
The Force is powerful, my young Padawan.
Polk championed limited government, expansion of the executive branch, hostility towards the banks, and an almost militant urge to expand the United States territorially.
You think, let's make it bigger!
These were all political ideologies that Jackson himself advocated for, and not only that, Jackson personally mentored and supported Polk as he rose throughout Tennessee politics. So the nickname of Young Hickory kind of denotes this familial connection, as well as a younger, energetic continuation of the Jacksonian ideology.
I'm younger than you, I'm better looking than you.
But it was never assured that Polk would win, as seen in negative nickname number 2, where he was called the Dark Horse President. Polk really was the first presidential elect who was an underdog throughout the entire campaign. He really was a candidate who was so unexpected and so obscure that when he did get elected, many people were like, who? This is because the political period after John Tyler was chaotic, to say the least. You see, the political party that John Tyler had been kicked out of was in complete collapse. Booting the President of the United States from your own party kinda does that to you. And it should have been natural for the party across the aisle to succeed in the next election, hands down. But the Democratic Party in the convention of 1844 was a divided party. But as political factions within the party vied for power, James K. Polk rose from the ashes and emerged as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. But unlike many other dark horse candidates in history, Polk didn't flounder. He accomplished every single one of his campaign promises with eerie efficiency, charging through the presidential office like a dark horse.
Is there a dark horse candidate out there for the Democrats?
But he charged in and charged right back out again 4 years later. And that earned him his third most popular positive nickname, the One-Term Wonder. At the beginning of his presidency, Polk vowed to serve only one term. And that kind of announcement of a political deadline hadn't come out of the White House since the likes of George Washington saying that he would only go 2 terms. Now we had a president only going 1. Most politicians are ambitious strivers, and that can come back to bite them in the butt when they make promises they end up not being able to keep. Looking at you, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Raise taxes and I'll say no, and they'll push and I'll say no, and they'll push again and I'll say to them, read my lips.
Polk, instead, was a man with a checklist, and he crammed almost a decade's worth of geopolitical change into 4 short years. He didn't waste time considering which steps to make and what implications they may have for his next re-election, and had a checklist. He just put his nose to the grindstone and got to work. When his time came, he left the office willingly, upholding his promise, as he should. You might be thinking, Teddy, you framed this man as a historical hero, and perhaps I have, but even the most illustrious of presidents screwed up. James K. Polk sure did, and Polk may have been that one-term wonder, only serving 4 years in the White House, but it was long enough for him to garner his fair share of spicy negative nicknames.
Ooh, that's spicy.
So today we're going to break down 3 of the most popular negative nicknames that people might have called him. Starting out with negative nickname number 1, James K. Polk was often called Perfidious Polk. Now this negative nickname has its origins in anti-war congressional speeches and political cartoons. The perfidity part of perfidious means a deliberate and absolute betrayal.
What is this if not betrayal?
So Polk was accused of betrayal? By who? Well, in this case, members of his own party. During Polk's presidency, the U.S. wasn't just facing rising tensions in its southern border with the Mexican-American War, but also in the north. Teething tensions of the War of 1812, not 30 years prior, hadn't calmed down any and were inflamed by American manifest destiny.
It's manifest destiny!
The British Empire, through the Dominion of Canada, had claimed territory in the Pacific Northwest near what is present-day Oregon. These British claims were hotly contested by Oregonians living in the area, some of whom were willing to go round 3 and fight another war against the British to secure the territory and fuel the fire of American expansionism.
Ready for round 3.
This is where JamesKPolk comes in. One of his campaign promises was the slogan 54-40 or fight. His campaign for the presidency had adopted this slogan in order to pull in the expansionist parts of his party. It essentially promised that the border between the United States and the Dominion of Canada would be set at the latitude of 54 degrees 40 minutes north. And if it wasn't, well, that second half of the phrase would come into play. There would be a fight.
I'll fight you both together if you want.
But being a smart man and a consummate politician, Polk knew that a war between the United States and the Dominion of Canada, and by proxy the British Empire, would be devastating. And so he did what we all must often have to do, compromised. And to many Northern Democrats in his party, that compromise felt like a betrayal. Compounding that with him getting the United States embroiled in the Mexican-American War, making the more peaceful factions of his party feel betrayed, and upending certain democratic norms where he didn't cooperate a lot with his own party in Congress, making them feel betrayed, it's easy to see how JamesKPolk might have been seen as the betrayer president.
No loyalty, no loyalty. None! Not even from you!
And that kind of betrayal moves us right into negative nickname number 2, where he was often mocked as the slaveholder's tool.
His weakness is he's a tool.
Northern abolitionist newspapers absolutely hated JamesKPolk. They believed that his expansion through the Mexican-American War and other land purchases into Texas, New Mexico, and California was a deliberate attempt to extend the power of Southern slaveholders. And this nickname captures a major truth about Polk. In my never-to-be humble opinion, his biggest moral failing, he was a proponent of slavery. He did support the expansion of the South's political balance, even if he cloaked it in the blanket of manifest destiny, which has its own moral problems.
What's that old phrase about two wrongs a right do not make?
In summary, this nickname paints Polk as a stooge of slavery, expanding the United States only for the benefit of the white slave-owning South elite. And finally, negative nick number 3 riffs on the idea of JamesKPolk being a dark horse or an underdog president, being referred to instead as the dark president. Polk was not the most charming guy. In historical accounts, it's often written that he had this sour, dark, brooding demeanor and was completely averse to social life.
I'm practically a hermit.
Even compared to the modern, almost socialite version of the presidency, a president in that era was expected to hobnob with political elites and work with the movers and shakers of society to get things done. Presidents from George Washington on up knew the importance of hosting balls and galas to get things done behind the scenes. The nickname made him out to be this kind of anti-Jackson. Not fiery, not charismatic, but cold and calculating and quiet. And JamesKPolk, for his part, he loved his secrecy. And of course, the political elites were okay with presidents working around behind the scenes, but only when they were looped in on it. JamesKPolk preferred to govern behind closed doors, and when those powerful people got shut out of what they believed was their right, they made a racket.
You went behind my back to cut me out. You fucked me.
Me? So there you can see that even a man who accomplished what most presidents do in 8 years in only half the time has his fair share of negative nicknames. Today we're going to be talking about the positive nicknames of President number 12, Zachary Taylor, which are surprisingly fun considering the man refused to vote, wore baggy old uniforms, and managed to stumble into the presidency on the back of pure battlefield stardom.
By direction of the President, I, Colonel Zachary Taylor, call this court-martial to order.
See, the United States had entered this period in history where they were waffling back and forth between career politicians and military presidents. And Zachary Taylor certainly was one of those battlefield presidents, and that is nowhere more clear than in his first positive nickname, Old Rough and Ready. This nickname was basically Tyler's entire political brand all rolled into 4 simple words. Tyler wasn't that epaulette-wearing, chest-puffed out of uniform kind of officer that you often saw in the antebellum years. He almost looked as if he had rolled down a hill on his way to the battle. He wore simple clothes, muddy boots. Kind of like Jackson before him, he slept where his men slept, ate what food they ate, and his soldiers loved him for it. He didn't act as though he was above the regular soldier, which was all too common for officers at the time, and he also had a reputation for being unflappable when things were falling apart. He definitely had a reputation for sitting calmly on his horse, chewing on something, while artillery fire rained down upon him and his men.
I'll follow you anywhere, sir.
So he definitely had the rough bit down. And whenever it was time for the momentum of battle to carry him forward, he was ready for it. And that whole persona, so simple, being old, rough, and ready, won him the presidency. Once again, there was a no-nonsense frontiersman general in the White House, and the people who put him there loved it. And as a former military man through and through, he would never escape this battlefield fame all the way through the White House. Continuing with his second most popular positive nickname, a little bit more formal than the first, he was hailed as the Hero of Buena Vista. During the Mexican-American War, Taylor's army was severely outnumbered at the Battle of Buena Vista by the forces under Mexican General Santa Anna. Taylor famously rode his horse out from beyond his own troops to rally them, crying famously, "Give 'em more grape, Captain Bragg," referring to grape shot coming out of cannons. Newspapers showered Taylor with praise, and his role in the battle became mythologized. Americans at this time were still on the high of manifest destiny and were eager to elevate heroes like Zachary Taylor. And the political establishment in Washington was in disarray.
We're in a political mess right now, Colonel.
So populism won the day. But this will move us into positive nickname number 3, which will exemplify just who Zachary Taylor really was at heart. He was referred to as Old Zach, the Reluctant Hero. Zachary Taylor was well known for his indifferent, almost hostile view of political ambition. He didn't chase fame, he didn't bolster his own reputation, he was almost dragged kicking and screaming into the presidency.
Get it away from me!
He didn't even vote for most of his adult life. He was the living embodiment of, "You want me to run for president?"
I don't want the job, and that's final.
And ironically, this made him even more popular, which bolstered his chances of being elected to the presidency that he didn't even want. This was the era of Jacksonian politics. The American public was suspicious of career politicians, and they wanted a common man who didn't want the job. It's really that final positive nickname that exemplifies him as a man born from service. A man who served as president for the duty of it, and not for personal ambition.
It's your duty, damn it! Your duty!
But not even wanting the job opened him up to all sorts of criticism. So today we're going to talk about his 3 most popular negative nicknames. We're going to start off with a real biter of an insult, printed mostly in newspapers beholden to the political party opposite him. They called him the military imbecile. Many in the Democratic Party establishment were angry that once again, a military hero from the Whig Party had recaptured the White House.
You're just a soldier without commands.
So newspapers loyal to that party seized on the most readily available insult applicable to him. Taylor was rough and Taylor was ready for battle, but intellectually, policy-wise, a bit empty-headed. As a career military man, Taylor had little formal education, and he found it very difficult to articulate any sort of formal policy position throughout his presidency. He simply didn't understand many of the political questions that were put before him.
I don't know, and I don't understand why. I can't remember.
And he really didn't help himself because he had no interest in the theory and legislative details that were required to govern effectively. Throughout his presidency, he relied heavily on advisors.
This is my royal vizier, Jafar.
And leaned on them to make decisions for him.
Now, run along and play with your little toys.
Critics didn't see this as Taylor being humble. They saw it as negligence, that he was simply negligent in his duties as the president, not doing a proper job.
Jafar, my most trusted counselor, plotting against me all this time.
They feared that the presidency had become a popularity contest, yielding to people who had more and more medals on their chest. Though it was pretty brutal, calling Zachary Taylor an idiot soldier wasn't necessarily too far off from the truth. And this insult goes hand in hand with negative nickname number 2, where he was called Old Zach the Know-Nothing. Taylor's presidential campaign was wildly successful, particularly because it took no strong stances on anything, really. The idea being you can't really lose if you don't piss anybody off.
Don't make him mad!
But that kind of non-committal attitude leaves you open to plenty of criticism. He avoided speaking his mind on all sorts of important questions that were sat before the nation. Slavery, tariffs, internal improvements. That allowed Congress to take the governmental reins, and as a result, not a lot got done during his presidency, and infamously kicking the can of slavery down the road led to worsening of tensions leading up to the Civil War. The nickname suggests that Taylor wasn't thoughtfully neutral, he just didn't know enough to pick and choose.
I'm not a smart man.
And finally, that leads us into our third most popular negative nickname. He, like many other presidents before him, was referred to as the accidental president, but not for why you might think. Yes, he became the president almost by a political fluke, riding into the presidency on the coattails of his military honor. But a huge reason as to why he's often forgot about in presidential history is he has the third shortest presidential term among all US presidents. He only served one term, and not even that, he died 16 months into his first term as president due to an unnamed stomach ailment. He wasn't even the first president to die in office. That was William Henry Harrison, and this fact even more assured that he would be looked on as an accidental president. It's almost as if he was there and gone again in the blink of a presidential eye.
And he's gone again, like a wind in the grass.
But that would allow his vice president, Millard Fillmore, to ascend to the presidency and earn his own nicknames. Unlike the president that he took over for, Zachary Taylor, who was a military man, Fillmore was a politician at heart. Fillmore is associated with stability, moderation, and pragmatic statecraft.
There are no allies in statecraft, Ilsa, only common interests.
He led the country through some really difficult times, keeping the government running, fully staffing his administration, and guiding the country through the Compromise of 1850. Many historians argue that he essentially bought time for the Union to get itself together before the coming Civil War.
Get yourself together.
He did this by being excellently proficient in public administration, which can be seen in his first positive nickname, where he was referred to as the American Louis Philippe. Fillmore supporters saw him as this moderate, bourgeois-minded statesman, similar to the successful constitutional monarchs in Europe. Louis Philippe I was the last monarch of France to be hailed as king, and he was referred to as the citizen king, very pragmatic and down-to-earth, and some people compared Millard Fillmore to him. This nickname praised Fillmore's dignified manner and portrayed him as this kind of pragmatic defender of the middle class.
Maybe I am middle class, in a way.
He was a politician who was not a demagogue. Through this nickname, he portrayed that managerial, moderate leadership that business interests and the respectable American public came to enjoy. In short, the American Louis Philippe was competent, civilized, and unexcitable.
He's smooth, he's competent, he's experienced.
And that'll move us right into positive nickname number 2, where he was both called the Compromiser and the Peacemaker. This nickname is mostly used by contemporaries who want to highlight his role in the Compromise of 1850. Throughout his presidency, Fillmore signed several measures that were aimed at diffusing immediate sectarian violence. He was forced to make those difficult moral decisions to keep the Union alive.
Call it the compromise of a desperate man.
Everything from negotiating California's entrance into the Union to controversially strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act. To many Northerners and Southerners who were tired of partisan fighting, Fillmore looked like a man who was making those tough calls to keep the Union together. Admirers hailed him as a peacemaker, setting aside his own moral convictions to hold the Union together through tough compromises.
Moral compromise does have its privileges.
But both of these nicknames focus more on his accomplishments at home. His last positive nickname focuses on his foreign policy. For his final nickname, he was called the Gateway President, or the Opener of Japan. Controversial today, but widely seen as one of his most successful foreign policy initiatives. This nickname heaps praise on Fillmore's decision to dispatch Commodore Matthew Perry in 1852 to force Japan to open itself up to international trade. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan had entered a period of isolation. During this period of sakoku, or locked country, almost all foreigners were banned from trading with the Japanese on the Japanese home islands, save for a couple of small trade enclaves where the Dutch and the Chinese traded through ports like the port of Nagasaki. But during this time, the United States was an economic powerhouse and pushing hard to work with trade envoys overseas. Fillmore and his allies saw Japan as an untapped market, a unique trading partner that would further push the United States out onto the world stage and perhaps distract from all the problems going on at home. Theoretically, the economic prosperity brought by this trade might ease tensions between the North and the South. But the shogunate didn't care about America's domestic problems, and it was going to take force to get them to open their country.
You want me to help ease the tension between the party?
Enter Fillmore's heavy-handed response in Commodore Matthew Perry. Fillmore ordered Perry to sail 4 steam-powered battleships, the USS Mississippi, Plymouth, Saratoga, and Susquehanna, and park this fleet in the waters outside of Japan to pressure them into signing a treaty allowing United States to trade with them.
A simple little transaction, a simple trade.
The Japanese had never seen steam-powered ships, and they said that they looked like giant dragons puffing smoke. Like it or hate it, Fillmore was able to accomplish something that no other world leader at the time had been able to. So he truly earned that nickname, the Gateway President and the Opener of Japan.
Terribly frustrating for you. A bunch of schoolchildren could accomplish what you could not.
But ending a nearly 260-year-long period of isolation, compromising morally on slavery, etc., while their incredible accomplishments definitely earned him his fair share of negative nicknames. History may remember the man as bland, but his critics in the 1850s were anything but bored with him. And that's why today we're going to be talking about his 3 most popular negative nicknames, insults reserved specifically for him. Starting with negative nickname number 1, and perhaps my favorite negative nickname so far, he was called the Dough-Faced President. You see, the term dough-face was an antebellum insult used against northern politicians who had been persuaded to support the South's cause of extending slavery's reach. These politicians were like dough, soft, pliable, and easily manipulated. To his former allies in the North, Fillmore seemed like a weak traitor when he not only signed but strongly enforced the Fugitive Slave Act.
Oh, don't you mention that traitor to us.
The Fugitive Slave Act was a horrendous law. It allowed for individuals to chase and recapture formerly enslaved folks who had fled the South on the Underground Railroad to escape slavery. This led to a horrendous rise in bounty hunters pursuing formerly enslaved people into the North and even kidnapping people who had never been slaves and dragging them back to plantations in the South, where Fillmore comes in. Not only did he sign the act into law, but as the nation's chief executive, it was his job to decide how strictly to enforce it. And enforce the law he did rather strictly, even in the North. Though he claimed that he signed this piece of legislation in order to keep the peace and prevent a civil war, which would end up coming anyways, his critics believed that he wasn't a neutral party, he was complicit in crimes against humanity.
They committed crimes against their own people. Against you.
He was accused of being a Southern sympathizer and way too easily persuaded to abandon his moral principles, being mushy like dough in the face of opposition. And that'll move us right into negative nickname number 2. Born out of satirical newspapers and political cartoons, he was called His Compromising Majesty. This negative nickname is a unique little twist on the negative nickname His Little Majesty used for James Madison when his critics were talking about presidential overreach. But instead, His Compromising Majesty being applied to Fillmore focuses more on his obsessive centrism and inability to move one way or another on political issues. You've probably heard the phrase, too much of anything is not a good thing, and yes, too much tyranny is definitely bad, but there can be danger in too much compromise as well, and Fillmore was nothing if a bit of an overabundant conciliator.
I mean, sure, there's a lot of compromise, but that's in everything.
This nickname argues that he governed like a European monarch, balancing different factions instead of actively leading from the front. You see, the danger was he believed that compromise was inherently virtuous, no matter if it meant terrible injustices followed. It's easy to see how some might have believed that he played moral issues like a chess game and treated people of color like pawns.
You just use me like a pawn.
Which will ironically move us into our final negative nickname, where he was referred to as the colorless president. Political commentators and even later historians would use this negative nickname to attack his personality. His leadership style and even his own personal behavior was seen as lackluster, uninspiring, and overly cautious.
He's boring, dull, common, and a snob.
His determination to tiptoe through the presidency made him a truly forgettable leader. His name isn't even one that is very well remembered in the American historical consciousness. The term colorless in this nickname implies a simple lack of red-blooded courage to stand up for his moral beliefs. An era of towering personalities like Jackson, Clay, and even Webster, Fillmore seemed like someone who was just accidentally left in charge of history. In the big picture, Fillmore's negative nicknames don't accuse him of corruption. They accuse him of complete moral failure. These negative nicknames blatantly accuse him of choosing stability over justice and legality over humanity. If Zachary Taylor was criticized for emptiness and Polk accused of scheming, Fillmore's legacy is that he would be criticized for compromise without conscience. But now we can move on from that legacy and instead talk about the legacy of President number 14, Franklin Pierce. You might remember me from a previous episode saying that the US during this time was waffling back and forth between politician presidents and war presidents, presidents who had served in the military in some capacity. Well, that was true with Fillmore and Pierce. We went right from Fillmore, who was a career politician and professional compromiser, to Pierce, who was a brigadier general in the US military. So when we're looking at his nicknames, we can see that his positive ones came more from those strengths as opposed to objective political success.
As a military man, you ought to know that.
Without any further ado, we can move right on into positive nickname number 1, where he was called Handsome Frank. Popular press and campaign culture in the 1840s and 50s had changed pretty significantly, and Pierce was conventionally attractive for his time. Campaign operatives and reporters alike used this nickname to showcase his genteel urban nature. They used it to make him seem approachable, and this was increasingly important in an era where image and personality were gaining increasing importance in political elections.
Did they have brains or knowledge? Don't make me laugh. They were popular.
And after 3 years of Fillmore, the public was clamoring for a commander-in-chief that was well-respected and they felt they could relate to. And Polk's wit, looks, and charm smoothed over the political weaknesses that had been left to him by the Fillmore administration, at least during the beginning of his presidency. Moving on to positive nickname number 2, he was also the second U.S. president to be called the Dark Horse President. During the 1852 Democratic National Convention, where the party had gotten together to try and decide who they were going to put forth to run for president, there was a series of failed votes where the individuals that everybody thought were going to be the nominees failed to secure any sort of significant lead. This is where Pierce emerged as a compromise candidate, and he wasn't thought of at first, hence Dark Horse.
It was getting so acrimonious, we decided to pick a compromise candidate at random from the newspaper.
Just like the first Dark Horse president, JamesKPolk, Pierce was really a nobody before this election. He didn't have much political experience to speak of and ran on a lot of military clout. But even though he had a shaky political base and not much history, he functioned as this kind of glue to hold the Democratic Party together as it was reeling from some serious sectarian violence.
This is what they mean when they call it bloody Kansas.
As a dark horse compromiser, he had this air of neutrality about him that clinched him the nomination and then finally the general election and the White House that came with it. Speaking of that military clout, he was often referred to as the soldier president or the war veteran president. Pierce served as a brigadier general in the Mexican-American War like several presidents before him. Allied newspapers seized on this to get veterans on his side.
We'll follow the old man wherever he wants to go.
You see, in the politics of the 1850s, battlefield experience gave you immediate credibility and patriotic legitimacy. But relying on that military legitimacy can be a double-edged sword for any politician. Pierce's military record was somewhat bland, and in no way would that experience give him the tools that he would need to handle the issue of slavery that would come to define his presidency. All in all, these positive nicknames point to an image built from compromise, charm, and military experience. But those traits alone would not be enough to keep him from making enemies who would make up negative nicknames about him. Starting off with a great one where he was called Fainting Frank, or the Fainting General. You see, Pierce's opponents seized on rumors and actual events of Franklin Pierce fainting during speeches and public events. While largely anecdotal, these rumors were woven into a negative nickname that would haunt him. The nickname was woven into a narrative that he was physically unsteady and lacked the nerve for high office.
You don't have the nerve.
At the same time as his supporters were emphasizing his physical handsomeness, his enemies were rallying against him and accusing him of being weak. And in 19th century politics, a physical weakness could very easily turn into what people saw as a character flaw. While the truth behind the negative nickname was mostly political theater, it stuck because it was easy to print in newspapers. And it unfortunately fit incredibly well with rumors of his drinking problem, mixing him to negative nickname number 2, where he was referred to as the hero of many a well-fought bottle. A riff on the expression hero of a many well-fought battle, this nickname talks about his reputation for excessive drinking that was exacerbated by some legitimate tragedies that happened during his lifetime. The public nature of the death of all 3 of his children and his wife's struggle to cope with those events mixed its way into some rather salacious rumors. A legitimate struggle with alcoholism was turned into a political weapon by his enemies, implying an utter lack of judgment and discipline characteristic for military men. But
now let me be clear.
This smear muddied some facts. Yes, Pierce did drink, and yes, he struggled with this grief, but there's really very little evidence that he continued to struggle with alcoholism while in the White House. But to his enemies, that didn't matter. The rhyme-like phrase was memorable and just enough to undermine public confidence in his leadership. That public confidence being sorely needed in the event that inspired negative nickname number 3, where he was referred to frequently as the Bleeding Kansas President. This nickname was used because although Congress proposed the bill, Pierce signed off and enforced the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Pierce's government leaned heavily on the idea of popular sovereignty. This was the idea that the people of Kansas should decide whether it was a slave state or free state by popular vote. As the territories of Kansas and Nebraska sought to become states, this would set the stage for a miniature civil war. Bands and militias of pro-slavery individuals in neighboring Missouri would cross the border to intimidate, entice fraud out of local electors, and kill to influence the vote. Likewise, free staters would flood the state in an attempt to keep it abolitionist, allied, and free of slavery. And though both sides would request federal help, it was the pro-slavery side that Pierce would side with. Though Kansas would enter the Union as a free state, it wouldn't be until 3 years after Pierce left office, and not until enough senators left office to join the Confederacy that the vote could go through. Pierce's critics argued that he sat by and didn't do enough, and some even went a step further, saying that he engineered the conflict to his political benefit.
You planned this all along, didn't you?
Many historians argue that Pierce's actions had catastrophic human consequences and was one of the last steps before an inevitable civil war. If his predecessor, Millard Fillmore, had been compromising too much in order to maintain the peace, Pierce was pouring metaphorical gasoline on the secessional fire.
That was truly a legendary accomplishment, making a bad situation worse.
Pierce's negative nicknames ring of moral and practical failure, which would set up his successor for disaster. That successor being none other than the 15th President of the United States, James Buchanan. nicknames of the 15th U.S. president are unique in that they point out two major things about him: his long career in government and a rather unusual personal life. And we'll jump right into positive nickname number 1, where he was called Old Buck. This affectionate tag, used by friends and later in life in newspapers, framed the man as a long-term public man.
He's a government man.
The nickname was used by friends and allies to inspire trust. It showed him as reliable and steady, that colleague who had been known to do good for decades. By the time he even ran for the presidency, he had been a congressman, a senator, an ambassador to the UK and Russia, and even a cabinet member. So colleagues used this kind of folksy nickname to express just how experienced this man was. He wasn't some elite grasping at power. He was your coworker who had been with the company for a long time and, old buck. And this theme of a man who had been around the block and had enough experience to do the job well was reflected in a positive nickname number 2, where he was also referred to as the old public functionary. This positive nickname showed up originally in the press, but was used actually by James Buchanan in his own State of the Union address in 1859. And it's easy to see why he encouraged the use of it himself. The nickname describes somebody whose life has been dedicated to public office and good administration.
I've dedicated my life to defending this country.
It presented him as a man who knew how Washington worked and a man who could keep things moving when there was increasing political gridlock as the United States began to break down as it approached the Civil War. That kind of methodical governance style was increasingly important in comparison to his predecessor, Franklin Pierce, who had seen the Bleeding Kansas incidents and several other incidences of political upheaval. Moderates were looking for some sort of consistency here, and they found it in James Buchanan. But more than that, it implied humility. It implied a man who was more willing to be judged by his accolades earned during years of service rather than spicy campaign rhetoric and promises that may or may not be fulfilled.
The mark of a true hero is humility.
His opponents tried to use this negatively to paint him as this career bureaucrat, but those complaints slid right off him when you looked at his record of service. To his supporters, it didn't matter whether he lacked boldness because his civil service record was exemplary. But here drops the other shoe, where I was talking about the fact that yes, he had a long service career. He also had a rather odd personal life. He was referred to as the Bachelor President for good reason. You see, James Buchanan never married, and to this day, he remains the only president in the United States to have never done so.
I'll let her know you're an eternal bachelor.
Yes, there have been divorcees and widowers in the White House, but never a bachelor other than Buchanan. And you would think this would be a huge disadvantage for him, but in fact it turned out to be quite the opposite. It was easy for his supporters to reframe him as almost Pope-like. Instead of marrying someone, he was married to the state. Supporters not only framed him as a man who had devoted his life to public service, but as someone who was free of familial concerns and used that freedom to govern incredibly effectively.
You don't need a family.
In an era where so many antebellum politicians had been scandalized by domestic incidences, he was quite the opposite. In fact, it was Buchanan's niece, Harriet Lane, who acted as the White House hostess and reinforced that kind of image of propriety. After the fractured home life of Franklin Pierce and his wife, it was easy to see how voters could have seen a bachelor president as someone to be admired. All three of these positive nicknames helped him win the presidency in 1856. They paint him to be that calm, experienced, level-headed man that Americans felt that they needed as they heard the thunderous cloud of the coming Civil War off in the distance. But unfortunately, that distance wasn't incredibly great, and there are those who accuse James Buchanan of not doing enough to stop the coming fracture of the Union. But we'll cover those next time. While the man did deserve his positive nicknames, he was the last sitting president before Lincoln and the coming Civil War, and many think that he deserves his 3 most popular negative nicknames more than his positive, so we'll go over them today. So we'll begin with negative nickname number 1, very popular with abolitionists, Northern Republicans, and anti-slavery Whigs, where he was called dough-faced, or the dough-faced president. Dough-faced was a common insult for politicians in antebellum America. It compared them to soft, pliable, mushy, and moldable bread dough.
But before you pass judgment on Gus, you have to understand what helped mold him into the asshole he is today.
This was because their enemies believed them persuadable to the side of slavery. Just like bread dough, James Buchanan was insulted as being pliable and easily manipulated into supporting the cause of the South just for the sake of peace. And there's some serious truth to this negative nickname. Buchanan himself defended the awful Dred Scott decision and even denied the Kansas Constitution and the provisions in it that would have allowed it to enter as a free state. What's worse is both contemporary and historical critics said that this kind of conciliation with Southern firebrands is what really led to the coming Civil War. This negative nickname damns Buchanan in this kind of if you give a pig a pancake political theory, that his conciliation with Southern slave owners on top of Franklin Pierce's conciliation made the Southerners too comfortable in their power and prone to overreact to even a moderate abolitionist like Abe Lincoln.
This seems the wrong time for conciliation.
In essence, in relationship to the Civil War, those who cried doughface believe that Buchanan started it. But that'll move us into negative nickname number 2, a little bit more of a nuanced negative nickname, where he was called the Bachelor President. Now, you'll notice that that was also one of his most popular positive nicknames, so let me break it down here for you. Yes, Buchanan was and is the only president to ever serve in the White House, having never married anyone. And gossiping critics of his day were only too happy to weaponize this fact. In an era where it was all too normal to be married extremely young and have children extremely young, Buchanan's unmarriedness was seen as odd.
He's odd, I grant you.
It implied, or at least implied to some people, a certain element of social awkwardness and a lack of familial grounding that some like to see in a leader. What's worse is he was quiet about his private life, and that only invited rumors of the most vile sort. Some have even insinuated that Buchanan was the first gay president, arguing that he had a lover. You see, while he was a junior politician working in Washington, D.C., he shared a home with Senator William Rufus King.
And they were roommates.
Oh my God, they were roommates.
Now, whether he was involved romantically or otherwise with King, Buchanan's critics weaponized the term bachelor president and weren't referring to him in a positive light when they were insinuating that he might be gay. While a relationship of that nature might be perfectly normal in today's society, back then it was dangerous for Buchanan to be associated with that, and although we're talking about his negative nicknames, it is fortunate that he managed to skirt those allegations, as there really isn't much evidence.
Well, it's just a rumor, of course.
So that will allow us to move on to negative nickname number 3, where he was referred to as the do-nothing president. Abolitionists, radical Republicans, and even his contemporary politician allies wanted him to do something more about the increasing sectarian violence in the South. They didn't just want him to do more, they wanted him to do anything.
Do something! Whoa! Anything!
They were incredibly frustrated with Buchanan's lack of action when it came to certain elements of the presidency. And that feeling only became worse towards the end of his presidency, as it was clear that Lincoln would become the next president and southern states started threatening secession. You see, Buchanan clung rather pathetically to an argument involving the Constitution that secession, states leaving the Union, was illegal, while at the same time arguing that the federal government couldn't do anything to prevent them from attempting it.
If I could, I would, but there's nothing I can do.
Unionists, people who wanted the United States to stay together both in the North and South, watched in terror as the threat of secession became more and more real, and their president, James Buchanan, did nothing to stop it. Even in the latter days of his presidency, when he was made aware that Fort Sumter, where the first shots of the United States Civil War would take place, was being surrounded by illegal rebel militias, he bungled the attempt to resupply the fort with necessary defensible materials, and that would contribute to Fort Sumter falling into the hands of the Confederacy in the very first battle of the Civil War. Add on to that the fact that he doubled down on the previously mentioned Bleeding Kansas affair initiated by his predecessor Franklin Pierce, and it just seems like there is one after another instances of serious governmental mismanagement. There's a reason why he, among many negative nicknames, bears the historical moniker of the worst president.
James Buchanan was a terrible president, perhaps our shittiest one.
He has his haters, but finally we can move on from Buchanan and talk about the president everyone's been waiting for and his three most popular positive nicknames, Abraham Lincoln. Nicknames wasn't too difficult, considering that Abraham Lincoln is consistently ranked among the top 5 favorite U.S. presidents in history. His positive nicknames are almost a historiography of the American self-made image, his humble beginnings to his constitutional innovation, and finally his status as a martyr. There is some historical complexity behind the praise. This is why I'll be adding one extra positive nickname that's a little less well known. Without further ado, we can begin with positive nickname number 1, one of the most recognizable presidential nicknames of all time, where he was known as Honest Abe. It's hard to overestimate just how powerful this nickname was. It was codified in newspapers and stump speeches, but developed through a series of stories built from his support base, from his citizen supporters. His frontier origins, being born and growing up in a log cabin, were supplemented by a series of widely told stories about how he would do such honest things as returning extra change to a shopkeeper.
Keep the change, you filthy animal.
Most importantly, refusing to promise political positions to friends and allies before he entered office, something that was all too common in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. You see, as politics ramped up towards the Civil War and people were more focused on the sectarian violence going on, more and more bribery and political scandals were coming to light as people were becoming careless, and the public was becoming increasingly frustrated with administrations that were more focused, possibly duly so, on preventing people from killing one another and not holding corrupt government officials to task. Lincoln's determination to avoid these scandals gave his image an air of uncorruptibility. In essence, the nickname suggested that the man was so honest that even if you disagreed with some of his decisions, you could trust his reasons behind it.
My name is Honest Abe Goodman, not Honest Abe Lincoln.
And this would be incredibly important later on in his term when he suspended habeas corpus and tried to push emancipation through an unwilling Congress.
This amendment is that cure!
This nickname and everything behind it was incredibly crucial as the Union's legitimacy hung in the balance, and Lincoln had to become a kind of moral arbiter. Second most popular positive nickname would be just as titanic in the historical minds of the American people, where he was referred to as the Great Emancipator. No getting away from being called that. While he wasn't the only one, by far, to push for the emancipation of African Americans, he did put forth an immense amount of effort from the executive office. Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, was incredibly important. It set the stage for the passage of the 13th Amendment and the abolishment of slavery evermore. Yes, the emancipation did turn the words of the Confederate leadership back against them, reframing their argument that it was a states' rights issue and instead an issue of common humanity. But it also opened up the door for the enlistment of African American soldiers. soldiers. After that 1863 proclamation, units like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment swelled the Union ranks. Almost 180,000 African-American soldiers joined the ranks of the Union, at one time composing almost 10% of the Union's entire military strength. This positive nickname highlights a strategic use of presidential wartime powers, and not only that, shows Lincoln's true colors as a man interested in the emancipation of slaves.
We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
And the last of our three most popular positive nicknames is definitely Old Abe. Lincoln, by all accounts, was not an old president. He was 56 at the time of his death. But there was a sharp comparison between him as the executive and a majority of the soldiers under his command being green Union boys under the age of 30 for sure. In fact, boys as young as 12 would serve as cavalry buglers and drummers, and errand boys running to get ammunition on fraught battlefields where brother fought against brother. And that's actually where the origin of the nickname comes from. It was utilized by soldiers as this kind of shorthand. The nickname was so endearing to soldiers in the Union that the 8th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment even had a bald eagle as their mascot, nicknamed Old Abe. The nickname was short, warm, and folksy, and blended that kind of public-private relationship with the commander-in-chief. Not only that, but the nickname is supported with how much the Civil War aged Abe.
By outward appearance, you're 10 years older than you were a year ago.
There are plenty of famous pictures of men entering the White House and then leaving it, looking as if they've aged double, triple, and even quadruple the number of years that they spent in office. But Abe served as commander-in-chief during wartime, quite possibly one of the worst and bloodiest wars America has ever had. It's not that difficult to look at the transformation and see how many people looked at Abe as a middle-aged man who quickly became old. The reason why it's still a positive nickname is it can be seen just how much of himself the man put into his job. The man sunk his final years and his youth into the office, and that was worth some respect. Above all, it helped sustain loyalty and morale in the population and soldiers in what really was a more protracted war than many Union generals thought it was going to be. In particular, Abe himself. Little bonus information here for you. Lincoln initially only requested 75,000 volunteers for a period of 90 days. They thought the Civil War would be over that quick. Little did they know it would stretch years. But perhaps that was because of this extra nickname where he was known as the Rail Splitter. Let me draw the connection for you. Republican leadership was looking for a populist candidate that they could use to win the 1860 election, and they found it in Abe. This nickname was pushed by the Republican leadership in order to tie Lincoln with common man labor. See, Lincoln's early life in the frontier of Indiana and Illinois included a great deal of physical labor. A lot of this labor would include splitting wood into split rail fences and separating property lines out there in the frontier. Republican political strategists knew that they needed to seize on this opportunity to present Lincoln as this kind of rough-hewn frontiersman in comparison to the Eastern aristocracy. The label features some deliberate political packaging, and not every rail-splitting story about Abraham Lincoln is true, but the nickname stuck for good reason. That reason being that it underscored the belief that leadership could and should come from hard work and moral grit. But even a man with that kind of moral grit would slip and make mistakes, and mistakes that would generate enemies, and enemies that would generate negative nicknames for him. Because just as he had crowds of admirers, he also had his fair share of enemies. We'll hop right into negative nickname number 1, where he was very often called King Abraham.
Estimable colleagues, 2 bloody years ago this month, His Highness King Abraham Africanus I.
Now, this nickname came from primarily Confederates, Northern Confederate sympathizers, and slave owners that used it in speeches and political cartoons and in the newspapers. The nickname accused him of abandoning his Republican political base and saying that he behaved more like a tyrant than anything. This majorly comes from his decision to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in border states and other regions during the Civil War. To provide a little context here, habeas corpus is a fundamental constitutional court order. It essentially demands that when an individual is arrested by law enforcement in the United States, before they are subjected to long-term confinement like prison, they must appear before a judge so law enforcement can make their case for why the person needs to be imprisoned.
This staffing is in compliance with the Supreme Court answering your request for a writ of habeas corpus regarding your medical treatment or lack of it since you've come here.
With the writ of habeas corpus being suspended, law enforcement under the Lincoln administration could detain people without bringing them before a judge and explaining why. Now, the Lincoln administration said that this was because the Union was in a state of complete disarray, a civil war, obviously, and that extreme measures needed to be taken to ensure the Confederate saboteurs and sympathizers couldn't just wreak havoc in the North. But for Lincoln, a man who was celebrated for his morals, it really was a bad look to sacrifice this kind of civil freedom for the sake of civil safety. But what's worse than that is his implementation of martial law in certain areas. At first, the Union Army was almost an entire volunteer army, but as the war dragged on for years, drafts had to be implemented, and there were a series of very nasty draft riots in New York City during Abraham Lincoln's term, and he cracked down on them hard. And while he maintained that his administration had to do this to keep the Union from crumbling, critics say that the emergency powers granted to him by the Republic wasn't enough, and that it was easy to accuse him of gathering and consolidating all of this constitutional power under his singular authority.
The power you give me, I will lay down when this crisis has abated.
Historians even today debate the necessity of Lincoln's actions and whether they even helped keep the Union solid during these latter days of the Civil War. This negative nickname encapsulates the real honest fear of people that Lincoln would become that tyrant king that many in the South were afraid he already was.
You remember when your pappy and I rode out to defend our way of life from the tyrant Lincoln?
And that fear will push us into negative nickname number 2, a rather macabre negative nickname where he was often called the Hangman. Regardless of what era, military justice in wartime is harsh. And Lincoln's military administration was no different. Lincoln authorized and presided over the summary executions of the Union's own deserters, spies, and saboteurs caught by the Union's military justice. While Lincoln himself didn't carry out the executions and wasn't there specifically for all of them, through his own established military commissions and commanders, the orders came down the chain, and when you're the President of the United States, the buck stops at you.
I'm the President, and as they say, the buck stops here.
Additionally, certain civilians complained that they were judged disloyal and treated terribly by the Lincoln administration. We can imagine that the moniker the Hangman really stung Lincoln because it personalized the decisions, the bloody decisions that were already taking place on the worst battlefields of American history. And regardless of whether he was directly responsible or not, Lincoln unleashed devil dogs like General William Tecumseh Sherman, a terrifyingly efficient general who, in his march from Atlanta to Savannah, his march to the sea, implemented total war upon the South in Georgia, burning as he went. Generals like Sherman were able to do what they did specifically because Lincoln commanded them to break the South's will to fight.
Break their will, so that they'll submit to your will.
And that'll move us finally into negative nickname number 3, an appearance-based insult where he was frequently mocked as the Ape. This one was used primarily by political cartoonists and vicious column opinion editors. But surprisingly, it was also used in the foreign press. By this time throughout the Western world, political journalism had developed into something more akin to what we know now, where you can frequently open the front page of the most common newspapers and see a caricature of some of your favorite and least favorite politicians of the day. And it evolved just in time to target Lincoln. whose lanky stature and gaunt, sunken face lended themselves well to this kind of grotesque caricature. Artistic opponents would often portray him as simian or ape-like or somehow subhuman.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
And truly, unfortunately, there was that mix-in element of the most appalling racism given Lincoln's goals for the Civil War to free African-American slaves, as the evidence of pathetic bigotry and partisan hack tactics. Truly, these nicknames tell us more about 19th century bullying than they do about substantive critiques of Lincoln himself. When it comes down to it, Lincoln is a prime example of how some of our best heroes have complicated legacies. His attacks on the Constitution and his willingness to resort to terrible violence stain an otherwise incredibly squeaky clean legacy. A legacy that would unfortunately follow him to the grave, as he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the middle of his second term, and his vice president, number 17, Andrew Johnson, came into the White House. We'll be going over his 3 most popular positive nicknames next time. Johnson's public image was messy and contested, but we're going to set that all aside when we talk about positive nickname number 1, where he was referred to as the Tennessee Tailor. Johnson really was a tailor by trade. He was a tailor's apprentice as a boy and even ended up owning and running his own shop in Greenville, Tennessee. So it's easy to see how his supporters would use and stress this nickname that emphasized his humble working class roots and built up this idea that he went from quiet, soft-spoken working man to public official.
That's true, Reptivia, but even a poor tailor is entitled to some happiness.
You see, as a running mate to President Lincoln, he was perfect. He was popular with Southern Democrats who hadn't supported the South in the Civil War but had stayed loyal to the Union. As more and more of Lincoln's public image got tied up in this grueling long war, Johnson was a great compromise candidate who brought those tailors and other workmen onto the boat of Lincoln's presidency. And even though he assumed the presidency after his predecessor's death, it was easy to see how his supporters continued to rally around that kind of working class, poverty to public office story that defines this positive nickname for Johnson.
I appreciate the offer, Jimmy, but I'm a tailor now, sorry.
And that'll pull us right into positive nickname number 2, where he was referred to commonly as the War Democrat. Johnson was just that, a member of the opposing party to Lincoln's Republican Party. It's kind of crazy to think nowadays of a modern president having their vice president, their VP, be from the opposite party entirely. But that broad support was exactly what Lincoln needed, and it followed Johnson as he ascended into the White House. This was because War Democrat was used as a badge of virtue. It meant that he had chosen his loyalty to the country over party or social class. It might not seem that way, but this positive nickname really shows Johnson's courage under pressure. It wasn't easy to be a War Democrat in the 1860s, the mid-1860s.
I am strong. I am courageous.
After most Southern Democrats had defected to the Confederacy, the fact that Johnson stayed stalwart made him a symbol of unity at the end of the Civil War. And he reassured a lot of voters, particularly in the South, that the reunification of these two ostensibly separate nations wasn't going to be punitive, punishing, or as bloody as it could be.
Once he surrenders, send his boys back to their homes, their farms, their shops. Liberality all around, not punishment. I don't want that. And the leaders, Jeff and the rest of them, if they escape, leave the country when my back's turned, that wouldn't upset me none.
However, as we'll see in his negative nicknames, this kind of ideal of quick reintegration without federal protections for freed peoples and those who had fought for the North stuck in the South, it really complicated his legacy. A legacy that has been and forever will be tied to the words Reconstruction, as his third and final most positive nickname is the Restorer. After the Confederacy collapsed, the economic conditions in the South were dire. The very little industry that the South had been decimated during the war. But Johnson saw the wisdom in the Reconstruction policies of his predecessor, Abe Lincoln. To the chagrin of many, Johnson at the very least realized that continued economic strife would not sew the two sides of the Civil War together in peace, and if Reconstruction wasn't handled properly, there would just be an endless cycle of blood.
The blood we shed begin an endless cycle of vengeance and death with no defendants.
Many hailed him as the restorer because they saw him as someone who would truly restore the Union and avoid a long military occupation of the South. For war-weary civilians, a majority of the U.S. population at this point, a quick return to civil governance was amazing as a concept, and there Andrew Johnson was as a beacon of that hope. But many argue, particularly contemporarily, that this quick push for peace and reconstitution of the Union sacrificed long-term justice for short-term peace. Even Johnson knew that there was tension within his legacy as president, and I'm sure he had his fair share of insults hurled his way. Insults that might have included negative nicknames. And here's some important context to consider when thinking about Andrew Johnson's negative nicknames. He was only a one-term president, and that first term began with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So much of his legacy is tied up in the end of the Civil War and stepping into the shoes of one of the greatest presidents of all time.
And Samuel Arnold, in traitorous and murderous conspiracy to kill then President Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and
it may not come as a surprise to you, but I'm not exactly the biggest fan of Andrew Johnson, and neither was I a fan of the other Andrew in the White House prior to him, Andrew Jackson. Funnily enough, they both share a negative nickname when their critics would call them King Andy. While Andrew Jackson was more frequently called King Andrew, King Andy, kind of making it a little bit littler, was meant to demean Johnson in a very specific way. Both presidents were accused of, before, during, and after their tenure, acting like monarchs.
Because he is a tyrant.
And it's easy to see in the historical record how it looked as though Andrew Johnson was pulling more and more power into the White House so that he could openly defy Congress and treat the norms of democracy as optional. Political satirists and cartoonists were particularly fond of this negative nickname, and in fact, a political cartoon portraying Johnson as a king appeared in Harper's Weekly rather frequently. Lincoln's Republicans, who controlled Congress at this time, were frustrated over Lincoln's own VP because the man, well, he vetoed so much of what they put on his desk.
If you veto that bill, Mr. President, you're going to get a huge public reaction.
It seemed as though every attempt at Reconstruction being guided as the Republicans had hoped it would was vetoed by Johnson. But Johnson himself argued that everything he was doing was perfectly constitutional, which technically it was.
we will make it illegal.
So Congress, who felt that everything the president was doing was an overreach where he was trying to place himself above the law and certainly above Congress, had to use this negative nickname to kind of boil down this complex constitutional fight into something a little bit more punchworthy. But even as he was trying to defend himself, saying that he was just trying to hasten the return to a civilian government, the Republicans turned around with another insult, the second most popular negative nickname attributed to him, calling him the whitewasher of rebels. Many, not just those in Congress, argued that Johnson was far too quick to reinstate the South's ruling class after an honest Confederate rebellion seen in the Civil War. Union veterans and citizens alike howled in anger as they saw their president depicted in political cartoons pardoning ex-Confederates from lowly soldiers and generals all the way up to government officials who had voted for the initial rebellion.
They're traitors, but also human.
To many Republicans who had fought for guaranteed freedom for formerly enslaved people, it seemed like a slap in the face. And many believed that the wave of hangings, lynchings, and brutal attempts from Southern radicals at reciprocity, it was all Johnson's fault in their view. And again, Johnson and his administration fell back on that we're just trying to fit the Union back together. And that made many Union soldiers wonder what kind of Union they had been fighting for. The nickname may be harsh, but it is based somewhat in reality. But with this next negative nickname, we can see how Johnson was really getting blasted from both sides, with his third most popular negative nickname being the Traitor. But he wasn't called that by the Northerners, primarily. He was called that by his fellows in the South. The infighting in that era between Confederate Democrats and Unionist Democrats was particularly brutal, and Johnson had decided to stay loyal to the Union, despite his party leading a rebellion. Traitor! He was reviled as a traitor to Southern honor, unlike those like Robert E. Lee, who, even though Lee had been offered a position as a general for the Union, had declined, saying that he could not, in good conscience, fight against the men of his own state. By contrast, Johnson was looked at as an opportunist, someone who stayed with the Union simply to hedge his bets. And of course, sometimes he got called a traitor by the Republicans of the North because of how much he torpedoed their efforts to push the Reconstruction of the South in the direction that they wanted him to. But make no mistake, Johnson was no Confederate commander or sympathizer. He was a Unionist through and through. And that made him a traitor to both sides in certain ways. And all of these negative nicknames would come to a head when Congress would get fed up and impeach him, making Andrew Johnson the first president in U.S. history to be impeached. But the details on that deserve their own video, and he for sure was not the last president to be impeached. These have been the three most popular negative nicknames of President number 17, Andrew Johnson. Join me next time as another general enters the White House in President number 18, Ulysses S. Grant. As with most of the military men who entered the White House, Grant's popular positive nicknames have to do a lot with his military service.
That's why he's a general and we ain't.
They were battlefield honorifics that got turned into nicknames that were used for the rest of his life. So instead, for positive nickname number 1, we're going to choose something that's a little bit more humanizing of the man. On his own name, he was called Uncle Sam Grant by his supporters. What's craziest about this positive nickname is that it highlights the fact that Ulysses S. Grant wasn't actually his birth name. He was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio as Hiram Ulysses Grant. The change in name actually comes from a mistake made by Ohio Congressman Thomas Hammer. You see, at the time, Grant was trying to get into the most prestigious war college in the country, West Point. But in order to do so, you must be nominated by a sitting congressman. And Thomas Hammer, unfortunately, misread Ulysses' name and put it down as Ulysses first, and filled in the S, and voila, Ulysses S. Grant. Despite the name switch-up, Grant got into West Point. While there, fellow soldiers in training really picked up on the whole U.S. Grant, sometimes even calling him United States Grant. And then came Uncle Sam Grant.
Good old Uncle Sam, huh?
Many of you are probably pretty familiar with Uncle Sam, the caricature of the U.S. government in human form. I'm going to make a whole video about the origin of that character, but for now, back to Grant. Grant really preferred the change around in initials. USG or US Grant was definitely a lot better than Hiram Ulysses Grant, which spells out hug, which in the machismo culture of the United States military probably didn't earn him a lot of respect.
It's a funny name for a man.
But more than that, the swap from Hiram to Ulysses made his nickname a little softer, made him seem less like a stiff future general and more a guy you would be happy to fight beside, someone who just as easily could be your neighbor outside of wartime. And especially as he entered his political career and it got shortened to Sam Grant, it really helped connect with people outside of the military. The nickname is affectionate rather than majestic, and that's why it stuck. But with that out the way, we have to talk about his military-inspired nicknames, moving on into positive nickname number 2, where he was called Unconditional Surrender Grant, another U.S. Grant nickname. This is arguably Ulysses' most common wartime nickname. See, in the early Civil War, Lincoln and the Union were having a tough time of it militarily. Partially because of a lack of preparation and a belief that the North would just quickly come to dominate the war, Lincoln and the Union Army struggled to make any forward progress and even were on the back foot with the Confederates marching northward and getting as far north eventually as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. A frustrated Lincoln fired general after general. McClellan, Pope, and Burnside all got thrown to the wayside as Lincoln continually got frustrated with his generals for not pushing the Confederacy harder.
God! Lee has gotten away again!
General Meade felt his troops were exhausted, sir.
He had reinforcements the next day. Lee had none.
The torrential rain made it difficult for the general.
And impossible for Lee. He had his back to the Potomac. He was trapped. He was unable to get his army back to Virginia.
Again, we had him in our grasp. We had only to reach out our hands and they were ours. But nothing I could say or do would make General Meade move.
Then came Grant. Make no mistake, he wasn't a one-man army, but he certainly did have the tenacity that Lincoln was looking for, and in particular, he had the ability to choose generals under him who shared his vision of how to win the war. But this positive nickname comes from early on in his military career there in the Civil War. It came directly from his response to Confederate Brigadier General Simon B. Buckner's request for terms of surrender at Fort Donelson in 1862. The war wouldn't end for another 3 years, and the Union had yet to get an upper hand, but Grant didn't care. His response was clear: unconditional surrender. Now, as the war continued on, and Grant moved up the ladder of the commanding generals of the Union's army, he didn't have the luxury of always demanding unconditional surrender. He did have to frequently negotiate terms rather than insist on absolute submission. But it was that first victory, that first response of unconditional surrender that really stuck with him as a positive nickname, and politically, it was gold branding opportunity. Let's not forget here, we're talking about Grant not just as a military man, but as a man who would occupy the White House. And after the country's frustration with his predecessor in Andrew Johnson, it's easy to see how this military fame swept him into the most powerful house in the country. And as such, his third most popular positive nickname is more an amalgamation of nicknames. He was referred to as the hero of this battle, the hero of that. Whatever battle you happen to be in geographic proximity to during the Civil War, you would know Grant had some hand in the winning of it.
He's a hero!
The hero of Vicksburg, for one, because of its long, protracted siege, but realistically, his most popular nickname in this category is definitely the hero of Appomattox. Widely viewed as one of the closing events of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, the commanding general for the remainder of the organized forces of the Confederacy, met Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Robert E. Lee's army of Confederate rebels had been beaten badly in the Battle of Appomattox and surrounded. Lee knew that his army was done. The Confederacy, as an organized resistance, was defeated. And Grant knew it too. You see, Grant had already been having conversations with Lincoln about what the military occupation of the South would look like as the Civil War wound to its inevitable end.
Once he surrenders, send his boys back to their homes, their farms, their shops.
Yes, sir.
And when it came to accepting the surrender of the South's most esteemed general, there was nobody better than Ulysses S. Grant to do it. Appomattox became a memoric symbol of national reconciliation after brutal fighting. And Grant's way of purporting himself in a plain, practical, free of humiliation politics manner earned him that honor. Make no mistake, Grant was no soft-hearted man. He had spent years grinding down the Confederacy's will to fight. But his ability to put that aside and focus on the broader national strategy of ending a war that had pitted brother against brother, it was worthy of being called a hero. Truly, Grant is worthy of all of these positive nicknames. But when the man entered the White House and the political field, that pragmatic general was unfortunately taken advantage of and suffered some serious scandals. Scandals that generated negative nicknames. Grant is one of the most well-known generals from the U.S. Civil War on the Union side of things, and it's easy to see how that spunk could have gotten him into the White House. But he had some trouble transitioning from general to politician. And so today we're going to talk about his three most popular negative nicknames, insults that people reserve specifically to call him. Now, the number of Grant's negative nicknames are pretty small, but they are blunt and sticky. They clung to him throughout the entirety of his presidency and into his legacy afterwards. So without further ado, we're going to talk about negative nickname number 1, where he was often called Grant the Butcher or the Butcher President.
Oh, he's a butcher.
It is no surprise that Grant would have a nickname like this, being one of the Union's top generals in the Civil War that ended not years prior to his presidency. This negative nickname really crystallized during the Civil War after the battles of Shiloh and Cold Harbor and the extreme casualties of those fights. These were both two incredibly hard-won Union victories. And his critics argued that there was a supreme lack of strategy on Grant's part. Although the Union won those respective battles and furthered their cause in those particular theaters of the war, the casualties on the Union side were immense. And as the commanding general, the buck stopped at Grant. Many saw Grant as just feeding men into the meat grinder in an endless pursuit of victory no matter the cost.
But if you insist upon coming, okay then, welcome to the meat grinder.
Many were terrified of the man, seeing him as a butcher who cared less about human life than about ending the war on his terms. Now, I will point out, this negative nickname is slightly unfair. Grant did have a strategy in this aspect of keeping the Confederacy under constant pressure so they couldn't recover, unlike the terrible failures of those commanding generals before him who had let the Confederacy recoup, retreat, and live to fight another day and harry the Union's troops even more. Not only that, Grant was at an incredible disadvantage here, fighting on the South's home turf, and fighting in one of the last line infantry wars, large-scale wars, that the United States would fight until the successive world wars. Advances in artillery, musketry, and even rifling made the death toll of the Civil War terrible, even in comparison to wars the U.S. had fought in just previously. But even though the label really misunderstands Grant, it stuck, and the butcher entered the White House. And what came along with him? But negative nickname number 2, an insult that dogged him through his military and then political career, where they referred to Grant as the drunk, or the drunkard president. Yes, Grant did have a pretty serious drinking problem, but not in the way that you might think. He wasn't a Winston Churchill drinking brandy every single day. Grant's problem was with binge drinking. Grant had served in the military one time before the Civil War, and when stationed in lonely areas, he had a reputation for getting blasted.
Julian! I don't know where I felt like I get a little drink around here, do you, bud?
Not only that, but he had a notably low tolerance, so even a few drinks would get the man blackout. After a string of deployments to the western frontier of the United States, where Grant was far away from his family and really anybody, and a series of these negative drinking incidents causing his reputation to be tied up with being a lightweight drunkard relying on the drink, Grant actually resigned the military in 1854. A little less than a decade later, when Grant threw himself back into the military for the Civil War, he maintained some sobriety. He relied heavily on his aide-de-camp and good friend John Rawlins to help encourage him to remain sober despite the harrowing experience of being a commanding general in one of the most bloody conflicts the United States has ever been involved in. However, there were some notable instances where he did relapse, particularly in 1863, though President Lincoln himself, when Grant's drinking was brought to his attention, said, "I can't spare the man," recognizing that despite his faults, Grant was incredibly important to the war effort. Grant was aware just how much of an issue this was for him and joined several temperance movements to try to stay true to the fight for sobriety. But the illness of addiction would follow him for the rest of his life, and even into the White House as he became the president. During peacetime, he smoked 8 to 9 cigars a day, but it was reported that during the Civil War, he smoked upwards of 20. These addictions would compound upon one another, with us now knowing today that both cigars and alcohol contribute towards certain mouth and oral cancer. And after he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1884, it was only a year later in 1885 when he died. And that disease of addiction would really weaken him in the White House when it came to negative nickname number 3, where he was referred to as Corrupt Grant, or the corrupt president. You see, Grant was always going to be on the back foot as he entered the presidency. his predecessor, Andrew Johnson, had been the first president to be impeached and spent the remainder of his presidency as a lame duck president, unable to get anything done, get anything pushed through Congress. As Johnson sat, the political schemers and true corrupt politicians looked to the next election with bated breath. They saw Grant, a man with little political experience, about to be elected to the highest office in the nation, and a man that they could take advantage of to make themselves rich. Grant's failing here was that he trusted people too readily, and he would often appoint personal friends and military comrades to positions that he thought they would be valuable in, when in all actuality, they would stab him in the back.
My brothers, they betrayed me.
The Whiskey Ring, the Indian Ring, the original Black Friday scandal were all issues of corruption that dogged Grant's presidency and made him look less like somebody who just didn't know how to stop it and more like someone who was actively complicit in the most blatant government corruption.
And very soon we'll see how complicit this creep is in all of the corruption and all the horror that's going on.
What's worse is because of Grant's deep-seated loyalty to some of these friends, he was very slow to punish or even remove them from office. Sometimes he even defended them, and it was easy to see how many would accuse the then-sitting president of cronyism. While his administration is widely seen as one of the most blatantly corrupt in U.S. presidential history, most historians agree that Grant was not complicit in the corruption, just ignorant of how to get it to stop. And like so many other military presidents of the U.S. presidential past, Grant served his 2 terms and then left, and the electorate chose instead someone with a little bit more political experience, the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, Hayes' positive nicknames were not really anything like his predecessor Grant's. He was not nearly as widely loved.
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
His reputation was much more about moderation, integrity, and reform, rather than one towering persona of presidential power like Grant. He came into the White House after a somewhat disputed election, and that was a difficult thing to overcome to achieve his positive nicknames. Nevertheless, he has plenty, and we're going to move right into positive nickname number 1. He was known in political circles as the Squire of Spiegel Grove. Now, this is an odd entry for a first positive nickname because it was primarily given to him after his tenure as presidency. Spiegel Grove is where he retired to after he left the White House. That highlights who Rutherford B. Hayes really was. He was a civil servant at heart, and he continued his work in local affairs, veterans issues, and many other problems even after the presidency, from his home in Spiegel Grove.
You know, R.E.D., retired, extremely dangerous.
And the nuance here is important. The term squire gives him this kind of dignity, but not the kind of pompous aristocratic dignity, but that of a landed individual, someone who is a common man. The term Squire of Spiegel Grove presents him as a country gentleman with responsibility and respect. And it fits Hayes remarkably well. He was not remembered as a bombastic national hero, but rather a citizen squire who continued to quietly work on reforms behind the scenes after he left the presidency. That'll move us right into positive nickname number 2, where he was referred to as the Statesman of Reunion. This is more of a retrospective honorific than any sort of campaign nickname. It first appears in Hamilton J. Eckenrode's biography of Hayes. The positive nickname really denotes the fact that Hayes was really trying to move the country from the conflict that Reconstruction had turned out to be under Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant into more of a cordial state of reunion. The rise of entities like the Ku Klux Klan and many other hateful organizations born out of the coals of the Confederacy plagued Hayes' presidential term. However, he pushed for a smoother end to Reconstruction than perhaps his predecessor Grant, who was a little bit more of an iron-gripped president, would have pushed for. Hayes prioritized that kind of stability that was still lacking even nearly a decade after the Civil War had ended. His entire presidency was almost one big compromise, and he rolled with it. as that man who sought reunion of that broken union.
It's a reunion.
And finally, there's positive nickname number 3, where he was referred to as the Good Colonel. Now, Hayes' presidency is one that really bucks that American trend of putting a military president in the White House, realizing that a general is not necessarily a great statesman, and then moving towards a more traditional politician. Hayes had his own experience in the military. One would have expected the country, tired of Grant and his struggles with combating corruption due to his lack of political experience, to discard any sort of military candidate at all, but Hayes himself was an officer in the Union Army, and he prided himself on the fact that he was an officer first and then became a president. Hayes repeatedly emphasized his wartime reputation, and that bolstered his credibility in the White House and amongst the U.S. military. It was incredibly important because through the Compromise of 1877, which led to his presidency, there was the organized removal of the final federal troops that were occupying the South to oversee Reconstruction. And it's for the fact that he wasn't saddled with the same warrior-conqueror reputation that Grant was, that many historians believe Rutherford B. Hayes was able to negotiate such a tenuous deal. All in all, Hayes' positive nicknames were less bombastic than most. He was an outsider, a reformer, a soldier gentleman, and somewhat of a homebody. He committed to a one-term pledge where he would only serve for his 4 years, that one singular term, and not run for re-election. And that, combined with the fact that he didn't attract that kind of thunderous, myth-making, nickname-giving clout that many of his predecessors had, allowed his negative nicknames to more greatly define who he's remembered as.
You know I have a very bad reputation.
And we're going to go through those negative nicknames next time. Nicknames were rather lackluster. The man himself was just kind of blah. But his negative nicknames, oh boy, are they spicy. His mildly positive public image was nowhere near enough to balance out the absolute controversial way that he attained the presidency.
Ooh, controversy.
And as such, most of his negative nicknames orbit around the fact that he didn't actually win the presidency. This becomes its most apparent in the first most popular negative nickname of Rutherford B. Hayes being RutherfordBHayes. In my never humble opinion, one of the best negative nickname insults of a president of all time. But to understand where calling him a fraud and even building it into his last name as an insult comes from, we have to analyze the Compromise of 1877. Stay with me here, I promise this won't take up too much of the video. Ulysses S. Grant had retired, the White House was vacant, and the election of 1876 was in full swing. Republicans put up Rutherford B. Hayes, but the Democrats put up a man by the name of Samuel J. Tilden. After the honest debacle that was Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, the Democratic Party enjoyed a resurgence of support, particularly from the newly reintegrated states in the South. Tilden won the popular vote by over 250,000 votes, but he faced trouble in the Electoral College. Tilden had 184 Electoral College votes, one short of the 185 he needed to win. Meanwhile, Hayes only had 165. 19 less than Tilden. Objectively, by both the popular vote and the Electoral College, Hayes was not going to be the president. 20 electoral votes remained in limbo, 19 of which belonged to southern states. To resolve the crisis, Congress convened a special commission to figure out what to do about this election. The Electoral Commission consisted of 15 members, 5 senators, 5 House representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices. The commission was originally designed to be completely nonpartisan. 7 of its members were Republicans, 7 of its members were Democrats, and there was that one independent tie-breaking vote, but the independent elector resigned at the last minute and was replaced by a Republican.
Your challenger's party now controls the House, and hence the House Committee on Elections.
And as such, the Electoral Commission voted along party lines in a nail-biting 8-7 vote to confirm Hayes as president. Without getting too much into the weeds, there was widespread condemnation over this entire process. It seemed like a man who had clearly lost actually won and became the president. There must be some sort of fraud going on here. And it was made even worse when the Republican-led Congress announced that they would be working with President Hayes to be removing the last of the federal troops that were occupying the South to oversee Reconstruction. Democrats saw this as evidence of a backroom deal to elect Hayes as president in exchange for removing those occupying troops. Now, let me be clear. There's absolutely no historical evidence that Hayes was involved in any sort of backroom deal-making to make himself the president. But this negative nickname, calling the man RutherfordBHayes, indicates just how much public distrust there was for this man. It fits well with a series of negative nicknames attributed to Hayes, where he was also called his fraudulency, and many other fraud-based negative nicknames. We'll move on from that to instead talk about his second most popular negative nickname, where he was often called in historical treatises as the tainted president. Even those who like Rutherford B. Hayes admit just how much his presidency was overshadowed by that compromise of 1877. And the rest of his presidency wasn't that great either.
Governor Axtell was forced to resign by President Rutherford B. Hayes.
He made the historic decision to end Reconstruction and, in many people's opinion, end it early. His decision to withdraw troops from the South, as well as several other decisions just to look the other way and pretend as though terrible things like lynchings and the rise of Jim Crow happening in the South just weren't happening, really tainted Rutherford B. Hayes both procedurally from how he got into office and morally by how he used and really abused that office.
Can we, pretend it's not happening and maybe it'll just go away?
Many historians argue, with good reason, that his tainted presidency stood in the way of African Americans being granted their civil rights earlier. And this would all kind of build to negative nickname number 3, where he was referred to as the de facto president. Much of Hayes' policymaking within his presidency was right in line with the Republican Party. He didn't have this strong position to chart his own course and define his own presidency. He was the de facto president, the generic brand, the Wish or Temu.com version of what a presidency after Grant could have been.
Every president since Rutherford B. Hayes has used that desk, except Johnson and Nixon.
And here's the irony. Hayes himself was regarded as pretty upright and in good standing. It's just his negative nicknames were so focused on the system that propped him up, and him being unfortunately okay with it. But he was another one-term wonder president, only serving those original 4 years in the White House. And he would pass along a deeply divided nation to his successor, President number 20, James A. Garfield. It was a little bit difficult finding a lot of positive nicknames for James Garfield because, well, the man was assassinated only 200 days into his presidency. That made him the second sitting U.S. president to be assassinated, as well as the second shortest serving president, only after Harrison. And this is truly unfortunate given how awesome the man seems to be from his 3 most popular positive nicknames. All of his positive labels seem to focus on the same 3 traits over and over and over again. So we'll talk first on positive nickname number 1, where he was called the teacher president. The man spent years as a professor at Hiram College in Ohio, even before he even thought about entering the political sphere. The positive nickname signals a mind shaped by the learning of classrooms, authority given to him by clear analytical thought. This kind of nickname was incredibly important specifically for Garfield's reputation because he was seen as this public academic figure and not just somebody who was beholden to the increasingly powerful political machines of the day.
I am a college professor.
The label also contains an appeal to democracy. A teacher is someone who elevates others through learning and understanding, not just commands them. So that was incredibly important for Garfield and his presidency, and definitely the top spot as his first most popular positive nickname. And rhyming with that first positive nickname is his second most popular positive nickname, the preacher president, teacher preacher. Garfield was, in fact, an ordained minister, preaching at many of the houses of faith in and around Hiram in Ohio. So whenever he wasn't in the classroom being a teacher, he was at the pulpit being a preacher. And it was that background in preaching that really elevated him into political stardom. The nickname leans on his moral seriousness and highlights that ability to use his strong oratory skills to speak with prophetic power. If you've ever seen someone speak at a pulpit with true conviction before, you'll know what I'm talking about.
God haven't turned his back on you. He's saying, but I'm allowing you to be tested in the wilderness because I want to see what's in you.
But the fact that positive nicknames 1 and 2 both had to do with roles and activities that he participated in should show you just how well-rounded of a man Garfield was. His preaching coexisted with teaching, yes, but also with him being a congressman, a Civil War general, and eventually president. This all combined to give him that kind of earned authority that was incredibly important among reform and religious-minded voters. So finally, we get to positive nickname number 3, perhaps the most elegant of all of Garfield's positive nicknames, where he was referred to as the Scholar President. Now, you might be wondering, how is that any different from being a teacher? Let me break it down. In an era where most education stopped at the small schoolhouse, with few individuals even attaining what would be comparable to a high school education today, Garfield went the extra mile. He never stopped learning. He might have been the teacher, but he also wasn't afraid to be the student and continue learning throughout his entire life. Becoming that collegiate professor before entering the White House allowed him to build up this reputation for being incredibly smart, and he deserved it. The man taught all sorts of classics: history, philosophy, Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and he even produced an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem while serving in Congress. Imagine that. You're the congressman to the right of this man, and you're thinking about what you're going to have for lunch when recess breaks, and he's over there solving mathematical equations.
It's clear that he's very smart.
But this positive nickname shouldn't flatten him into just the smart one or like a very intelligent president. He was clever in so many different ways. He was an incredible Civil War tactician as well. He would eventually come to command the Army of the Ohio and even come to the aid of future sitting president UlyssesSGrant. What's even more incredible is considering the fact that Garfield was born into poverty. His education was self-made. The man had gumption. Sadly, we would never really get a true picture of what it would be like to have an intellectual powerhouse like this man in the White House, as he was unfortunately assassinated by a mentally ill individual who believed that Garfield owed him political favors. But it wasn't just his assassin, Charles Guiteau, who had issues with Garfield and his methodology when it came to governance. So next time, we're going to cover his 3 most popular negative nicknames. As I mentioned in the video about his positive nicknames, Garfield was assassinated very shortly into his presidential term. So a majority of these negative nicknames he garnered in his life before the White House.
They shot me, then.
Not only that, but there were a few negative nicknames made up about the man after he passed, because who's going to make fun of a dead guy? One who especially had a bright future as president, but not everybody was Garfield's cheerleader. And this all starts with members of his own party calling him a negative nickname that would follow him into the White House, where he was known as the half-breed president. Now, in an era just after the Civil War, you might assume this was some sort of racial slur, but quite the opposite. This negative nickname was purely political. You see, Garfield was really associated with the reform wing of the Republican Party at this time. He saw that now that formal Reconstruction had been torpedoed and the Democrats of the South were gaining political power, that his party would need some sort of element of reform to keep a hold of their voter base amongst the American people. But there were plenty in the Republican Party at that time known as the stalwarts, who were more conservative in their ideology that the Republican Party should not change, and should not change from the party of Lincoln. But Lincoln had been dead for 15 years at this point, and reformers like Garfield recognized that there needed to be some change. So members of his own party associated him with those radical reformers, arguing that he was only half a real Republican, a half-breed president.
When they dug me up, I was only half a man.
Whenever he broke with the larger Republican Party to get something done and to get his party to embrace reform, he was seen as a traitor to his own Republican cause. But a lot more of his criticism comes from his time before politics, before schooling, from his time in Ohio where he was growing up. Political adversaries would often use a series of nicknames. I'm going to wrap up into negative nickname number 2, where he was referred to as the Canal Boy or the Plow Boy of Ohio. To provide a little background, when Garfield was only 16, he worked the canals of Ohio as a hoggy and a bowman. A hoggy, at least I think I'm pronouncing that right, was an animal driver. Many of these canal boats were pulled along by oxen, or more commonly donkeys, along those currents of the canals.
Worked the Great Lakes in the Erie Canal, sir.
He was also a bowman, where he handled the ship's navigation, which, when it's a canal, is just kind of straightforward, so not too complex work. But ironically, during his very short stint there, he only worked 6 weeks. He managed to fall into the canal 14 times, and he also contracted malaria, and so he wasn't having it and left. And while his campaign kind of seized on this of purporting Garfield to be a common working man, even though it was later in the 19th century politics still had quite a deal of wealth and class signaling. His opponents liked to use this negative nickname, as well as calling him the Plowboy of Ohio, to indicate that he was unrefined, unsophisticated, and unfit to do the job of something as high class as politics.
George comes from the so-called lower class, Dexter from the upper. Well,
Garfield had the misfortune to rise to power in the Gilded Age, an era of increasing industrialization, financial magnates, and an increasing complex federal government. Even if you were a goody two-shoes like Garfield was ostensibly, many in American politics believed that you needed a certain level of sophistication to maneuver around the political elites and machines of politics like Tammany Hall that had come to dominate the governance of the United States. But his third most popular negative nickname would challenge that squeaky clean image of his. When a major congressional corruption scandal involving railroad financing came to light in the 1870s, Garfield was implicated. And as such, many of his enemies took to calling him the Credit Mobilier Man. The invention of the steam locomotive and reliable rail systems being laid across the United States at this time revolutionized transportation, but with that revolution came incredible financial power in the hands of companies like the Union Pacific Railroad Company. They say that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and this is nowhere more true than with Union Pacific.
There are those in Washington who believe the West will never be settled. Northern Pacific Railroad will never breach Nebraska.
In 1872, executives of Union Pacific created a spin-off construction company by the name of Credit Mobilier of America. They did this so that they could overcharge on construction costs for the Transcontinental Railroad. But the problem was they were overcharging the federal government using government funds. And this kind of behavior was kind of an open secret, at least in Congress, because Union Pacific, through Credit Mobilier, sold shares of this company really cheaply to congressmen to basically bribe them. In the end, it's estimated that work that should have only cost about $50 million ended up with a whopping price tag of $94 million. And this fraud, there's really no other word for it, had been going on for a while. It even involved shares sold to a man by the name of Schuyler Colfax, who had been Ulysses S. Grant's vice president. And by the time that Garfield became president, Grant had been president 2 presidents ago. Now, Garfield himself was never implicated in the scandal.
And there are those in Washington who do not wish the Union Pacific well.
But there were enough people close to him and around him and who supported him who were guilty. And that kind of unclear ambiguity as to Garfield being guilty or not, that's gasoline in politics, and he got thrown in the fire. So you can see how that final most popular negative nickname was meant to be a shorthand to cast doubt on his integrity as a person and eventually as a president. Perhaps if he had lived longer, been president longer, he would have been able to build a legacy for himself that would have transcended these negative nicknames, but alas, he became the second sitting US president to be assassinated. And instead, his successor, Vice President Chester A. Arthur, would rise to the presidency and become the 21st man to inhabit the White House. Once again, my name's Teddy Ebby. These have been the 3 most popular negative nicknames of President number 20, James A. Garfield. Tune in next time.